Then she scolded herself for worrying about that when her husband was in such agony. She had to get him to a doctor, to a hospital. Deborah fished for her cell phone, but there was no signal. None. She turned the radio on, but the only station she could find was a conspiracy theory talk show. She switched it off. Tears ran down her face as she drove. 3 times she saw flashing red and blue police lights, but they were on some other road, parallel to where she was and far away, heading toward the blast. And she did not want to go back there for anything. Deborah didn't know if it was some terrorist thing or something equally horrifying, but she wanted no part of it. In the darkness beside her, Roger moaned and shifted. She touched him as gently as she could, and he didn't hiss or jerk away. Maybe he wasn't as bad as he looked, she thought, praying that she was right. "Roger?" she asked. "Hold on, baby. We're going to the hospital." He moaned softly, an inarticulate sound, like a dreaming person might make. He pawed for her hand, though, and she let him take it. "It's okay, honey. We'll get this taken care of." Roger kissed her hand, and his tenderness, even this deep into the horrors of his own pain, came close to breaking her heart. Fresh tears filled her eyes as she spoke soothing words to him, meaningless words, more a sound of comfort than any promises she knew she could keep. The world beyond the windshield was wet and vast and dark, and she had no idea where the closest hospital was. She drove on, faster than anything that was safe or sane. Roger put her fingertips in his mouth, kissed them, and licked them? It was such a strange thing, like he was trying to nurse on her fingers the way a child would at her breast. God, was he that damaged? Was he that far gone that he was reduced to a childlike state, an infantile state? "Oh, Roger." A heartbeat later, she screamed as Roger bit down on her fingers. Chapter 70. Stebbins Little School, Stebbins, Pennsylvania. Des Fox knew that she should scream. A scream would be good. It would punctuate this moment, seal it, send it into eternity. People were supposed to scream when they died, especially when they died like this, trapped inside a nightmare. Yet when she opened her mouth, she said, "JT." In her ears, the name sounded like Daddy. It meant the same thing to her. The dead shuffled forward, stumbling over the sprawled limbs of their dead companions. Some of them tripped and fell, but they got up again, mindless of cracked kneecaps and fractured wrists from their collisions with the unforgiving ground. Des backed away, but she knew that she had nowhere to run. There were zombies between her and the school. The lighted window was 50 yards away. It might have been a window on the face of the moon for all that it mattered to her. She saw figures moving inside, teachers, parents, maybe even Billy. It didn't matter. "JT," she said. And as if in answer to her speaking that name, she thought she heard his voice. "This isn't done, girl." "JT?" "Desdemona, you listen to me. You're a cop, and you're a good one, but you're not acting like one now." I can't. I don't." The closest of the infected were a dozen feet away. In 4 steps they would have her. 4. "What about the kids, Des?" asked JT. "What about the little ones?" The school was 1,000,000 miles away. "I let them die." "Damn it, girl, don't give me that crap. It's not your fault some damn fool opened that window." 3 steps. She could smell their burned flesh. I let them die, JT. I should have been there. I should have been smarter. You can't unring that bell, girl, he said sternly, his voice as clear as if he stood right beside her. You can't undo that, but you can damn well save the rest of them. No, I can't. You can. That's your job. Saving them is why you became a cop. Saving them is what's kept you alive all these years, and you know it. 2 steps. JT, how can I do this? You know how. I don't, she said. But even as she said it, her hands touched her belt, feeling the things clipped to it. The pouches with the handcuffs, the empty slots for magazines, the pepper spray. Nothing there. No help. The stun gun. No use against the dead. They didn't react to pain. Damn it, Des, be smarter than that, growled JT. Stun gun. The dead were driven by parasites. That's what Billy had told her. The parasites shut off most of the body's functions except a little respiration, a little blood flow, and the nerves needed for standing, moving, grabbing, biting, swallowing. Nerves. Nerves. Nerve conduction. The hands touched her sleeves, her shoulders, her breasts, her face. And then her hand drew the taser. Nerve conduction. She heard JT laugh quietly. There you go. You're not the fastest, girl. We both know that, but damn if you don't always get there in the end. The weapon came free of its holster. The Nova SP5. The stun gun had a 5-shot magazine. Open a door and go home, said JT. She brought the weapon up, activating the laser sight, found a target a yard from her, fired. The flechettes whipped through the air and struck the dead flesh high on the chest. The charge surged through the wires, and instantly the infected body arched back, all 4 limbs trembling like a puppet hanging in a stiff wind. The eyes bulged wide and the mouth opened, and it tried to scream. Scream. Oh, God. It actually tried to scream. 2 other infected were behind it, pressed against it to try and get to her. The rain and the intensity of the charge flashed from one to the other, and the 3 of them were suddenly falling. Falling, opening a hole in the wall of charred flesh. Des released the first cartridge and chambered the second, moving now, running through that hole. She fired again, and a woman with no eyes suddenly juddered to a stop and then fell away, a whistling shriek rising from between her burned lips. The scream was the first human sound any of these monsters had made. It chilled Des Fox all the way to the core of her soul. The screams were so normal. God, did that mean the people who had been in those bodies before the infection took over were still in there? Don't think about it, bellowed JT. Run! Run! She ran. She released the second cartridge, fired a third, heard another tearing scream of human pain. The zombies tried to close in on her, but she smashed into them, driven now by panic as much as need. She elbowed them and jump-kicked them in the stomachs and rammed them with her shoulders. 2 shots left, and 20 yards to go. The air around her was suddenly split apart by thunder. Small thunder. Not from the sky, but from... Gunfire rippled from the windows of the school. All of the windows. A dozen barrels cracked. 4 of the zombies went down. 2 stayed down. 2 others began instantly to climb back to their feet, their bodies absorbing anything except headshots. "Des!" called a voice. And this time it wasn't the ghost of J.T. Hammond hollering in her fractured mind. It was Billy Trout. "Run! The side door! Go, go, go!" She saw it then. The staff entrance door stood ajar, and 5 men were clustered there. Piper was among them, a shotgun spitting fire in his hands. Des fired her 4th shot, and a man she recognized. Albert Thomas, who owned a tattoo parlor on Buckley Road, staggered back, a human cry torn from his dead throat. It sounded like Albert, too. But there was a quality to it, a rising note of panic, as if in that one instant the man she knew was able to give voice to all the horrors that had been done to him. And it was then, with perfect and dreadful clarity, that Des Fox realized the true and full extent of what Dr. Volker had unleashed on humanity. Lucifer 113 was intended to make Homer Gibbon be aware of every moment, every sensation of what was happening to him as his dead body rotted in a coffin and was consumed by maggots. This was a punishment intended for a serial killer to make him pay for what he had done to the innocent. And now it was doing that to every single infected person. They were all in there, their consciousness trapped in the hijacked bodies, aware, connected to nerve endings, and totally unable to prevent their stolen flesh from committing unspeakable things. Only in the moment of intense electric shock from the stun gun were those people able to give voice, to cry out for mercy, for forgiveness, for release. As she ran, Des thought about the effect that bullets had. It ended the unnatural life of the living dead. Did it also end their torment? Was a bullet to the brain a kindness? It was so twisted and perverse a concept that even as she ran, she nearly doubled over and vomited. There was one last zombie between her and the door, but it was in a direct line between her and the men with guns. She had one charge left in her gun. Could she use it, knowing this ugly truth? Could she bear to hear that scream again, knowing that she couldn't then end the suffering of the person trapped inside the dead flesh? It came at her, mouth wide to bite, hands reaching to grab. She shot it in the throat, hoping to drop it without the scream. But it screamed anyway. It screamed like someone burning in the fires of hell itself. The infected fell away, and then human hands reached for her and pulled her inside the school and then slammed the door shut. Bodies thudded against the outside of the door, and down the halls, echoing from the classrooms, there was a last volley of gunfire. Then 3 spaced shots from the hallway. Des knew what those shots meant. 3 shots for 3 small heads, followed by the sound of retching and weeping. Chapter 71. Stebbins Fayette County line, north of the Bordentown Starbucks. Dustin Lee Fry was making the slowest getaway he'd ever heard of. It was driving him crazy. 4 hours ago, a friend of his had dropped him at the parking lot of the Woodsman Rest, right off Route 381 in Fayette County. Dustin had crouched under a dark gray poncho in driving rain, waiting for his ex-girlfriend's new boy toy to come to work. The boyfriend, a shovel-jawed goon with little pig eyes, worked the night shift as bartender at the Rest, and that meant he'd be on until 2 a.m. At 10 minutes to 8, Shoveljaw roared into the lot in his 1970 Mustang Boss 429, a perfectly restored, mint-condition classic muscle car. The grabber green skin seemed to glow in the downspill of light from the sodium vapor bulbs arranged around the parking lot. Over $200,000 worth of car, bought for the asshole by his daddy, who owned big chunks of logging and pulp all through Pennsylvania and Maryland. Dustin didn't think it was at all fair that the pea-brained mouth-breather should have his ex-girlfriend and one of the sweetest cars in the world. Actually, as Dustin saw it, he could keep the girl. She and Dustin had ended things badly. Harsh language was involved. So was a restraining order. Not the happiest times in his life. She was elsewhere, probably fretting over what to do about the stretch marks now that Shoveljaw had knocked her up, if the baby was even his. There had been one last bout of make-up sex with Dustin before everything went to shit, so the whole paternity thing was a dice roll. The car, though. Dustin didn't want the Neanderthal to have the car. It wasn't fair. The car was perfect. From tailpipe to headlights, it was the absolutely perfect car. And assholes should not be allowed to have perfect cars. Dustin was sure there was a law about that somewhere. Or ought to be. So, stealing the car, in Dustin's view, was not so much a matter of committing a crime as it was serving the public welfare. He waited for Shoveljaw to park the car in his special extra-wide slot, lock it, give the creamy green hood its usual pat, and go into the Hunters Club to mix drinks for the other mouth-breathers. The parking lot was nearly deserted, though, because of Superstorm Zelda. A smarter person, Dustin mused, would have called out and stayed at home. But no one ever called this guy smart. Rich? Yes. Obnoxious? To be sure. Smart? Not so much. Dustin started to get up so he could boost the Mustang, but another car came crunching over the gravel. 2 men got out and hurried through the rain to the restaurant. Then another came. And another. Then one of the cars left. It was like that for hours. Despite everything that was happening in the skies and the world, the damn place was doing bang-up business. Dustin was afraid to leave his hiding spot for a minute, sure that someone would spot him and then there'd be real trouble. Finally, well after 1 a.m, the steady in-and-out flow dwindled and died. There was a protracted silence, and when it seemed apparent that the last drinkers inside were going to take it all the way to the bell, Dustin rose up quickly from his place of concealment beside the dumpster and drifted around the perimeter of the parking lot to come up behind the Mustang. Dustin had a friend who boosted cars on a regular basis, not professionally, more of a hobby, but he was good at it, who had lent him a Slim Jim and a key gun. Dustin moved to the driver's door, checked the lot again, eased the Slim Jim from under the poncho, and fed the thin strip of metal down between the glass and the door. Popping the lock was a breeze. He shucked the poncho and slid behind the wheel, mindful to keep the rain off the leather seats. He chunked the door shut and fed the teeth of the key gun into the ignition. The engine started at once, and it started with a very loud, very distinctive growl. All of those horses under the hood shouting at the storm. Dustin had no idea if Shoveljaw heard the car start. He didn't wait to find out. He put the car in gear, spun the wheel, and kicked 10 pounds of wet gravel at the back of the restaurant as he peeled out. As soon as he was out of the lot, he turned left and followed a couple of crooked feeder roads until one spilled him out onto 381, where he turned north to catch 653, and from there he planned to turn the car west and drive it until he figured out what tomorrow would look like. But after he turned onto Route 653 and drove 10 miles, crossing out of Fayette and cruising the outer edges of Stebbins County, things started to slide downhill. First, it was the rain. The sky split apart with thunder, and for a moment it seemed as if the clouds themselves were being ignited by lightning. Flash after flash, boom after boom. It hurt his eyes and rattled the windows, and the rain that fell was so thick that the windshield wipers did exactly nothing. It slowed him to a nervous crawl. All he could make out were the taillights directly in front of him. Those lights rolled forward at barely over 20 miles an hour, and it was like that for a long time. The rain did not let up once. Dustin had never seen rain like this before. Then the car in front of him, an old Camry, slowed more and more. It finally stopped, and after a long time, the driver shut his engine off. The rain only began slackening after Dustin had been sitting there for 10 more minutes. It was still coming down pretty steadily, but it wasn't wrath of God rain. It wasn't Noah's Ark rain. The Camry up front didn't move, though. The driver simply sat there. Dustin didn't dare toot his horn or make any kind of fuss. Not while driving a stolen car worth a couple of hundred G's. No, sir, that would be monumentally stupid. So he waited. And waited. That's when the thunder started again, and lightning. Except that's not what it was, and Dustin realized it by slow degrees as balls of yellow light lifted from over the horizon. He watched as the light illuminated the thousands of cars stalled in long lines ahead of him, and in the rear view he could see thousands more dwindling into the distance behind him. Then he heard the screams and the gunfire. Dustin had seen every war film and action movie ever made. He knew the sound of heavy-caliber machine gun fire. "Holy shit," he said aloud. People were running up the road between the cars, fleeing whatever the hell was happening, but also fighting? He leaned forward to peer out at the night. Not 100 feet away, he saw a woman in a pretty autumn dress dive at a guy in coveralls, slam him against the fender of a Chevy Aveo, and "Holy shit!" he cried, as he saw blood shoot up from the man's neck like water from a broken fountain. 2 men pulled open the front doors of an Expedition and dove in. Blood splashed the insides of the rear window. A teenager with one arm missing, just fucking gone, ran directly at the front of Dustin's car and flung himself onto the hood, denting it, smearing it with blood. "Holy shit!" screamed Dustin. He put the car in reverse to get away as the one-armed teenager began pounding on the windshield. The Mustang shot back only 20 inches before crunching into the front end of a Focus. "Fuck you!" bellowed Dustin, both at the Focus and the insane teenager. He threw it into drive and rammed forward, crushing the grill against the Camry's rear. Glass exploded, and one of Dustin's headlights went blind. 5 minutes ago, he would have been heartbroken if a roadstone tore a fingernail-sized scratch on the grabber green hood. Now he rammed forward and back 3 times, accordioning the bumpers, screaming at the howling thing that still knelt on the hood and pounding one-handed on the glass. Then he had an opening, and he was out. He jerked left out of the lane and onto the shoulder, spilling the bloody teenager off with a bone-jarring crunch. Beside the shoulder was a drop-off that was filled with water, and it looked like a death trap to Dustin. Behind him, other cars were pulling out and blocking the route for a backing-up escape. A quarter mile ahead, there was a wide pull-off. If he could get there, maybe he could find a way to cut across the median. The opposite lane was completely clear. Farther along the road, he saw a guy on a motorcycle do exactly that. So Dustin shifted again and hit the gas, sending the big Mustang rocketing forward. At that moment, there was the biggest explosion yet from over the hill. A massive fireball that seemed to lift the whole road up and drop it. Thousands of people fled from it, screaming and bleeding, chased by waves of heat that set their hair and clothes ablaze. Behind them, mixed in with them, attacking them as they ran, were other people, wild-eyed and bloody, with snapping teeth and grabbing hands. Some of them were on fire too, but they didn't seem to care about that. All they seemed to want, or seemed capable of wanting, were the people who ran from them. Heat punched at the Mustang, blackening the green paint, covering the windshield with ash. And in one frozen moment, Dustin could see things in that ash. Tiny thread-like worms that wriggled as the hot wind slapped them against the glass. There were other things hitting the car, too. Pieces of charred meat, pieces of broken bone, and burning swatches of cloth. Dustin's mind absorbed all of that visual data in a microsecond, and then he drove the gas pedal to the floor and the Boss 429 engine hurled the Mustang at the crowd of living and dead. By the time he hit the wall of them, he was going 50 miles an hour. Dustin felt himself rising from the seat. He felt the steering wheel hit him in the chest, saw the windshield coming at him so fast, so fast. The fires and explosions, the rockets and bullets, the teeth and hands of the dead, none of that did any harm to Dustin Lee Fry. In the end, It was the car that killed him. South of the Bordentown Starbucks. Major General Simeon Zetter got slowly out of his command vehicle and watched hell unfold. He and his aides were in the safe zone, outside of the blast area, well beyond the perimeter of violence that the satellites and surveillance helicopters determined enclosed all of the infection. No one spoke. No words really fit the moment. During the drive here from the school, Zetter was absorbing the intel from FEMA, from the White House, and from other sources. Initial estimates of potential civilian casualties were staggering. 4,000 minimum. Minimum. More than that were expected. More than that were likely, perhaps inevitable. The fireballs from the fuel air bombs rose like the pillars of hell, seeming to push back the storm. The heat was so intense that it turned the rain to steam. Behind where he stood, the Blackhawks and Apaches were touching down in the parking lot of an abandoned drive-in movie theater. It had been dangerous, bordering on foolhardy, to have them in the air at all with a storm of this kind, and they had lost one crew to a crash. Something he had not yet reported to the president. Now, with these bombs, there would be shock waves that would endanger all the others. He heard one of his aides say something to himself, and for a moment, Zetter thought it was a prayer. It wasn't. It was the thing that Oppenheimer had said when the first atom bomb was tested. I am become Shiva, destroyer of worlds. And while fuel air bombs were non-nuclear, the point was eloquent. Zetter felt like striking the man, but hitting someone for speaking the truth was not the way to survive this moment. In silence, he endured the rebuke implicit in that statement. Destroyer of worlds. Destroyer of lives. So many people. The outer edge of the heat wave rolled through the night toward them. It had been greatly weakened by distance and did little more than brush past his face and fill his mouth with a bitter taste. Zetter turned and discreetly spat into the mud. Some of the others did too. A few still wore their hazmat masks. The heat blew past them, and for a moment there was a deceptive stillness, a calm that told lies about the night. Then the rains began to fall again, and the storm winds blew, and the sounds of screams echoed through the night. Car horns blared, faint and muted. "Sir," said another aide, hurrying toward him from the communication truck. "You need to see this." His voice held a rising note of panic that made Zetter spin around and go running after him, with his other aides in tow. As he ran, Zetter turned and spat again, trying to clear his mouth of the acrid, itchy dust from the shockwave. He felt sick to his stomach, but he decided that it was the shock, the stress, the horror of it all. In that, General Zetter was entirely wrong. Across the Fayette County line, Pennsylvania. They moved across the quarantine zone, alone and in packs, in the ragged, bloody, and fire-blackened clothes of farmers and tourists, travelers and news reporters. A few wore National Guard BDUs. They moved together, weeping, crying out in unending pain from bites that had torn through skin and muscle, or from blistered burns that bubbled on skin that had been touched by the hellish heat. They staggered away from the flaming pit where the Starbucks had been, and away from the blackened shells of their cars. They left behind friends and family members. Those that could run did. The rest limped and shambled and crawled. Away from the bombs and the bullets and the things that bit. None of them had a plan or a direction. They simply fled. And the dead followed after. Chapter 72. Stebbins Little School, Stebbins, Pennsylvania. Trout and Des sat in the principal's office. Mrs. Madison had found a blanket and wrapped it around Des's shoulders, but rainwater dripped from her clothes and pooled on the floor beneath her chair. Trout pulled his chair close and sat with his hand on her knee. He thought she'd object to that, but after a while she squeezed his hand. Mrs. Madison sat across from her. Uriah Piper and Jenny DeGroot were in the office as well. No one else. "It was Jerry Dunphy's," said Jenny. Des looked at her. "What?" "He was supposed to be helping in the kitchen, cutting open cereal boxes, but when I looked up, he was gone. I figured he went to the bathroom or..." "Or what?" asked Trout. "Or needed to find a quiet place to cry." Everyone tried not to look at Des, but one by one they did, and it made Trout wince. Mrs. Madison tried to console her. "Please don't think you're in any way responsible for what Mr. Dunphy did. He was deeply distraught by everything that's happened, and fuck him," Des said quietly. Mrs. Madison blinked. "Pardon?" "Fuck Jerry Dunphy and fuck his being distraught. And fuck you for whatever you're about to say," she said. "I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear any bullshit from anyone. Dunphy's opened that window and he got 3 kids killed. End of story, and may he burn in hell." "That's hardly fair," said Piper. "It's unrealistic," agreed Mrs. Madison. "Shock can induce many different degrees of psychosis." "Since when are you a psychologist?" sneered Des. "Since I got my M.A. in psychotherapy and child counseling before you were born." "Yeah? Well, fuck your M.A. too." Mrs. Madison recoiled and her throat flushed pink. "Des," Trout said gently, "let's dial it down and most of all, fuck you, Billy Trout." She slapped his hand off her knees. "Okay, so Jerry Dunphy was batshit. A lot of that going around. Our town is overrun by zombies and we've just been abandoned by the military. Batshit seems to be the only flavor we have left, so we all better get used to sucking on it. You want to know how batshit crazy I am? When I was out there surrounded by all those friggin' dead sons of bitches with no ammunition, you know who helped me? You want to know who talked me through it? You know who saved my life? J.T. motherfucking Hammond. Yeah, my dead partner, my best friend, the man who helped save all of your lives. He had my back and told me what to do and how to get through it, just like he always did. How's that for batshit?" The room was utterly silent. Des leaned forward and fixed Mrs. Madison with a steely stare. "You want to know the kicker to that? Even now, even knowing that I'm crazy my own self, even right here in your office, I can still hear JT's voice, telling me to stop yelling, telling me to watch my language, telling me to take it out of overdrive. Yeah, I can hear that clear as day." "Des," began Trout, but she ignored him. Des sat back. "We're all crazy. Fine. If it's the way things are, then it's the way things are. I'll be happy to talk to the rest of the adults and explain the facts of life to them. If any of them are too fucked up in the head to be part of how we're going to survive, they have my permission to hang themselves or give themselves a sponge bath with steak sauce and go outside. But they don't take any of the kids with them. They don't let the kids see it, and they don't let those fucking zombies in here. And if anyone does anything to endanger the other kids, I will personally shove a gun up their ass and pull the trigger. That is not, I repeat, not a joke. Am I making myself crystal fucking clear here? Or do I need to start kicking some basic survival sense into everyone in this frigging school?" The silence following her words was heavy and long. Trout looked at the faces of the others, tried to read their eyes and predict what they'd say. It was Uriah Piper who spoke first. "I won't shoot anyone for being crazy or stupid," he said. "But if you need to do that, I'll load your guns for you." Mrs. Madison gave a slow, grudging nod. A strange smile formed on Jenny DeGroot's young face. "I'm absolutely with you, Des." Des and everyone else turned to Trout. He cocked an eyebrow. "Honey, if you even need to ask, then you really are batshit." The harsh mask of anger and hurt on Dez's face softened. "Thanks, Billy. But if you ever call me honey again, I'll kneecap you." "I'll take my chances." Piper cleared his throat. "I hate to interrupt a tender moment here." "Fuck you," Dez and Trout said at the same time. "But I need to get back to securing the building. Looks pretty clear that there are more of those things out there, and for whatever reason, they seem to be coming here." Dez started to nod, then abruptly held up a hand. Wait. No. "What?" asked Trout. "When I was outside," she began slowly. "The buses." "What about them?" She began shaking her head. "We're thinking about this the wrong damn way. Jesus, how could I have been so dumb?" She stood up, dropping the blanket to the floor and walking to the door. She opened it and looked out through the suite of offices toward the main part of the school. Her gaze roved over everything, including the walls and the ceiling. Then she turned and leaned against the frame and shook her head again. "When this thing started, I came here because I knew this was where they were going to take the kids. Town shelter and all that. Okay, fine, it's strong and defensible, and we have some supplies. Then we were locked in here by the National Guard. This became our place. You see what I'm saying?" No one did. "We thought we were going to ride it out in here. The Guard would airdrop food and supplies, and the geniuses at the CDC would cook up a cure or a vaccine or something. Then the frickin' Guard lit out of here like their asses were on fire. It wasn't an orderly retreat, and it wasn't the kind of wrap-up you have after a field deployment has completed its job. No, the way they went tear-assing their way out of here means they were going to a fight, and it was a bigger fight than they anticipated. Armies plan and move with some kind of order. They only bolt and run when the shit has seriously hit the fan. Then there was that explosion. Or maybe it was a series of them. Big fucking airbursts. Not nuclear, because we'd all be dying right now if they'd dropped a nuke on Stebbins or Bordentown. No, I think they found a big fucking nest of these things and they tried to sterilize them with fuel air bombs." "What are they?" asked Jenny. "Thermobaric cluster bombs. It's the biggest and most powerful non-nuclear device we have." "Dear God," murmured Mrs. Madison. "I see where you're going with this," said Trout. "Can't say I like it." "I don't see," said Jenny. "Last resort," said Piper, and both Trout and Dez nodded. The farmer explained. "A bomb like that wouldn't be something they'd use if they could contain this with regular tanks and helicopters and such. Scorched earth is what you go for when you're losing a fight." "Exactly," said Dez. "I'm still not following," said Jenny. "Does that mean they wiped them out?" Trout fielded that. "You didn't see the infected who were outside. They were all burned. The bomb may have killed some of them, but it didn't kill all of them. Any of them who weren't in the direct blast zone, any of them who were only burned, are still out there. And after what just happened, I think it's pretty clear they're coming here." "Here? But why? I mean, wasn't this just random? Weren't these infected just whichever ones were in the area?" "No," said Dez. "They were too badly burned. They're coming here from closer to wherever Ground Zero was." "The blast was north and west," said Trout. "Over by Bordentown, or near there." He paused. "Which is where the quarantine zone line is." And where Goat was, he thought. But he didn't say it. "Okay," said Jenny. "But again, why here? Why the school?" "Yes," said Mrs. Madison. "Surely you're not saying they can smell the children here?" "With the rain?" mused Piper. "Probably not." "Well, then why?" Trout glanced at Dez. "I've wondered this before. I know the infected are supposed to be, for all intents and purposes, brainless, brain dead, but could there be some trace left? Maybe something the parasite drive can tap into? Genetic memory. There's a precedent in science." Dez turned haunted eyes away from him. "I don't care what's driving them. I don't care if they are coming here because they remember the school or because they think it's prom night. Fuck it. The point is that they are coming here, and if we stay here, then this place is going to stop being a refuge and start being an all-you-can-eat buffet." She turned back to them, and now her eyes were cold and dangerous. "And I will not let that happen." Trout said, "What do you have in mind?" Chapter 73. The Situation Room, the White House, Washington, D.C. "Talk to me," croaked the president in a voice grown hoarse with yelling and pleading. "Where are we with containment?" Every eye turned away from him and focused on the big screen and its many smaller windows. The satellite thermal scan still showed hundreds of dots moving in all directions. Smaller windows were ground-level views from military vehicles and some field troop helmet cams as they engaged the infected. The sounds of gunfire, even muted to a whisper, were dreadful, and there was so much screaming. From the infected who had not yet died, from possibly uninfected civilians running from the blasts, and from the dead, and from the soldiers. "Sir," said General Burroughs. "General Zetter is requesting orders on what to do with uninfected survivors." Sylvia Ruddy said, "How can we tell if they're uninfected? Do we have a way to triage this?" "Scott?" asked the president. Blair felt like he was a passenger on a sinking ship. Like he was the only man to have seen the iceberg, but no one had paid attention to his shouts of warning. Now the president wanted answers from him. Solutions. "Sir," he said slowly, "we do not have the protocols or resources to triage anyone. We don't have the manpower on the ground to detain and monitor large numbers of civilians." "What are you saying?" demanded the president. "What I'm saying, sir, is that we cannot afford the luxury of treating anyone as potentially uninfected. We have to respond as if every person coming across those fields is a carrier, every single one." The president got to his feet and towered over Blair. "Are you insane?" "No, sir. You asked for my recommendation. That is the only possible course of action." "I refuse to accept that, goddammit!" Blair rose as well. "Refusing to accept the truth about Lucifer 113 is what brought us to this point, Mr. President. We have acted timidly and slowly from the beginning, and we are fighting an uphill battle." "Those are survivors." Blair pointed a finger at the screen. "They're already dead." "No," said the president, with a stubborn shake of his head. "Simeon Zetter will contain this." Blair gaped at him, simply unable to speak. On the screen, with every second that passed, the images told a story that anyone with eyes could understand, but everyone with hearts refused to accept. Except for Blair. Chapter 74. Stebbins Little School, Stebbins, Pennsylvania. Des and Trout called a meeting of as many of the adults as could be spared from guard duty and child care. Trout suggested that everyone meet them downstairs in the gymnasium. "Why there?" asked Des, as she and Trout went down to wait for them to gather. "People died down there today." "Right," he told her. "We're better to make your point about how safe the school isn't." "You want me to play these people?" "Of course I do, Des. Play them and then lead them, because you are the best chance we all have of getting out of here." Des studied him for a moment, then gave him a small, wicked smile. "If we ever get ourselves out of this thing, Billy, I'm gonna bang your eyes crooked. You've done that more than once. I ain't saying we're getting back together, but yeah, I think a little recreational yeehaw might take some of the edge off." "That's all it'll be," he said, arching an eyebrow. "Something to settle the nerves." "You have a problem with that?" "Not even a little one." Des bent and gave him a quick, wet, delicious kiss. But instead of the quick catch and release he expected, she took his face in both hands and looked deeply into his eyes. Her smile faded away completely. I wasn't screwing around back there. When? When I said I heard JT talking to me. He smiled. Wait, you're telling me you're crazy? You? Des Fox? You shock me, woman. Shock me, I say. Oh, fuck you. I believe that is what we've been discussing. She kissed him again. When she was done, he did not feel a single one of his injuries. He was gasping for air when she pushed him back. He was also hard as a rock, and he believed that there was never a less sensible or convenient time for an erection in the entire history of sexual congress. Des, quick as always, saw the bulge, and her smile came right back. Before she could hit him with a joke, he said, "No, it's not a gun in my pocket. I'm just very damn glad to be here with you." She reached down and cupped his hardness through the stained cloth of his jeans. "Careful now," she said, "or you'll make a girl blush." She gave him a squeeze, then released him and turned quickly away as the gymnasium door opened and people began filing in. Billy Trout genuinely hoped he had enough time either for a cold shower or to spend 5 useful minutes banging his head on a brick wall. Chapter 75. On the Road, Pittsburgh Suburbs. "Why are we going to Pittsburgh?" asked Goat, though he thought he knew the answer. Homer shot him a sly look. "See a few old friends." Goat knew that he should just keep his mouth shut, but despite all of his fear, the pain in his body, and the absolute strangeness of this experience, there was a part of him that was still a newsman. Or maybe it was the other aspect, a somewhat older and more precisely defining aspect of who he was, the filmmaker. This was all good drama. It would be great cinema. Cinema verite in real point of fact, because this was the truth. This was real. It only felt like a nightmare. He said, "You're going to find your foster parents, aren't you?" It was the first time Goat saw Homer lose control. It was brief, but it was there. The car swayed, and for a moment, the look on Homer's face wasn't that of a killer or a monster. It was the lost and desperate look of a child. Goat knew the story. He'd been in the courtroom during testimony by prison psychiatrists and social workers. After Gibbon's heroin-addicted mother had given him up for adoption, Homer went through one foster home after another. In a couple of them, the child had endured horrific sexual and physical abuse. One of those former foster parents was later arrested in connection with the abuse of another child, and investigators found hundreds of photos stored on the man's computer. Photos of him and various girlfriends and drinking buddies doing things to children, boys and girls ranging in age from 5 to 12. That sickened everyone in the courtroom. Billy Trout had gone outside and thrown up in a trash can. Goat tried to look at the poster board-sized reproductions of those photos as clinically as he could, pretending in his mind that these were movie props. But the bitter and raw truth of them gouged marks on his soul. The photos were presented as part of Homer's defense, claiming that any crimes he had committed were direct results of permanent emotional and psychological disfigurement inflicted upon him as a child. Disfigurement. That was the word one psychologist used, and it stuck for the duration of the trial, becoming a catchphrase. It was a word Goat had never before heard used in that context, and he could not shake the ugly awareness of all it implied. The defense was thorough and exhaustive in an attempt to cultivate sympathy through horror, but rather than any sympathetic reaction, the effect was to emotionally numb the jury. They disengaged from the evidence, and Goat watched that happen. It's how he would have filmed the scene. As far as he saw it, the defense lost the case more than the prosecution won it, and it did so by an overuse of the most compelling argument. The expression that flitted across Homer's face now was tied to those memories, and Goat was absolutely sure that in that moment Homer felt rude hands on him and cringed at the thought of how, once again, his body and his world would be plundered. When Homer spoke, his voice was quiet, filled with a false calm that was as fragile as spun glass. "There's a couple of people I wouldn't mind saying hello to. People I never got around to thanking." "Thanking?" Homer turned to him, and the smile that formed on his lips was inhuman, repulsive, vile. "For opening the black eye and teaching me how to speak with the red mouth." Goat didn't dare reply to that. Homer gestured to Goat's equipment. "Shouldn't you be taping this shit?" "Yes," said Goat quickly, realizing that this was gold and that it was his lifeline. He unzipped his bag, removed the camera, plugged it into his laptop, and adjusted the settings. He turned the dome light on because otherwise it was far too dark, but the yellow light chased only some of the shadows away. There still seemed to be too many bits of darkness hiding in the cab, waiting to pounce. Goat found some small steadying comfort in the process of handling the tools of his trade. It returned to him a measure of personal power. "Okay, we're good to go." "What do you want me to do?" "I'll do a quick introduction and then you could just talk," suggested Goat. "Tell your side of it." "My side?" "Well, tell the truth as you see it. Or would you rather I ask questions?" "I don't know. Set it up and let's see what happens. But don't say where we are, okay?" "No problem." He hit record, then turned the camera on himself, gave his name and his affiliation with regional satellite news. Then he pointed the camera at Homer and introduced him. Homer gave the camera a few glances that were almost shy. People and cameras, thought Goat. Weird. As Goat checked the feed on his laptop, he loaded Foursquare and tried to connect the locator app to a GPS app, but there was no Wi-Fi signal. "You want this on the net, right?" he asked. "Yeah." "Okay, then once we tape some stuff, we have to get to someplace where I can pick up a signal, any place with free Wi-Fi." Homer thought about that, then nodded. "Sure." "Are you ready?" asked Goat. Part of his mind seemed to stand at a distance and watch all of this with slack-jawed amazement. They were both flash-burned, filthy, bloody, and on the run from murders and some kind of catastrophic military action, and here he was, talking to Homer like they were ready to talk about the Daffodil Festival or a Little League game. It worried Goat that he could sound so normal, act so normal, when normal was something as dead as yesterday's news. He heard his voice speak with every appearance of calm control as he set up the video. "We're on the road. I can't say where. Stebbins County has been, or is in the process of being, destroyed. You've heard some of the field reports by Billy Trout about what happened. All of it is real. However, I have a different part of the story to share, and it's one everyone is going to want to hear. This is a side of the story that will help everyone understand the man who stands at the center of this storm. A man most people in the world believe was executed 2 days ago at Rockview Prison here in Pennsylvania. A man who is now beyond death as anyone knows it. And that statement is neither an exaggeration nor a joke. The next voice you'll hear, the next face you'll see, is that of Homer Gibbon." He turned the camera and switched on the top-mounted light for extra effect. He wanted the image to transform from the murky yellow shadows to something brighter and harsher, something that would show the bright red blood. In the stark light, Homer was every bit the true monster. All sharp angles and brutality, but with a bestial intelligence glittering in his dark eyes. Homer did not speak immediately, and his lack of certainty and clear discomfort kept the dead silence from being empty. This was great theater, thought Goat. This was fucking great. After a few thoughtful seconds, Homer said, "Everyone thinks I'm a monster." "What do you think?" asked Goat. Nearly a mile passed before Homer answered, "Maybe they're right. Maybe that's what I am now, a monster. I guess now more than ever." Homer shook his head, and Goat wondered if there was a flicker of regret in the killer's voice, or was he filtering this through his filmmaker's ear? "People use that word," Homer went on, "monster. They like to throw words like that around the way a monkey tosses his shit, hoping it'll stick to the walls. They don't understand anything about what goes on in a person's head, just like they don't understand what it means to be something different, something bigger." He laughed. "It's like witches." "I'm sorry, witches?" "Sure. In prison, you got nothing to do but read books, and I read this one book, Witch Hunts, A History of the Burning Times. It had a lot of pictures in it like a comic book, but it's not superhero stuff. This was about real stuff that happened. What do you call a book like that?" "A graphic novel?" "Yeah, that was it. This one was about the history of witches and the things people used to do to them because everyone had some stupid idea that witches were giving blowjobs to the devil or some shit. Goofy stuff like that. What it really was that people, men mostly, were afraid of the witches because of what the witches knew. And what they called witches were just women who knew some important shit. Medicine like that. Natural healing and all that sort of thing. Herbs and liniments and potions. There wasn't anything with the devil. It wasn't about that. You know why those men killed those women?" "Tell me," said Goat. "It was because those women knew something the men didn't. They had secret knowledge, and that knowledge didn't come from the men. The men didn't own it, and they couldn't control it. Those women were out there using this secret knowledge, and they didn't need jack squat from the men, and that really scared the men. You only got power if someone needs something from you, and you have a leash on it. You understand?" "Yes, I do." "Those men, they knew that the women weren't fucking around with the devil or any of that shit. That's not why they got mad. They got mad because the secrets the women had were starting to matter to the people, the common folk. Those men saw their stranglehold over everyone starting to slip, and that meant they'd lose money, and they'd lose power, and they couldn't have that. So they said that those women, those witches, were monsters. And since most people are just dumb fucks, they went along with it, and soon they were burning chicks at the stake and drowning them and crushing them under rocks. That's how the men kept their power. It's how scared people always keep their power. That's why they killed Jesus. That's why they killed that little Indian guy, Gandhi." He pronounced it Gandhi. "It's probably why they killed John Lennon, too, because that son of a bitch definitely knew some of the real secrets." Homer nodded to himself. "He sings to me in my head sometimes. Did you know that?" "No. What does he sing?" "Well, I don't know the names of the songs. New stuff that he wrote after he died." "Oh," said Goat, and felt vaguely disappointed. He couldn't quite understand why. "My point," continued Homer, "is that people throw out the word monster before they know what something is, and it's stupid. It's an insult, because that word is so small. And sometimes what they're trying to describe is way bigger than they know, bigger than they can even imagine. And you feel that the way in which they used it to describe you is the same kind of error? The same kind of small thinking? That is, them being, what, blind or simply unable to understand what they are seeing? Homer took a long time with that, and as he drove he kept looking at Goat, as if reappraising him. He nodded a few times to himself. "Now I'm wondering," he said slowly, "whether you're one of those smart-ass fellas who know how to feed someone enough of a line of bullshit so he can save his own ass." Goat said nothing. "Or if maybe you're starting to see what the black eye wants you to see, and maybe hear what the red mouth is whispering. Tell me, son, which is it?" There was no way to know how to respond, because Goat could imagine how either response might spark something nasty. If he admitted that he was stringing Homer along, then the killer might simply pull over and finish what he almost started back at Starbucks. On the other hand, if Goat came off like a willing convert, would there be a price to pay to join Homer's church? In the end, he told Homer a version of the truth, and he meant every word. "I don't know what to believe," he admitted, "but I'm sitting here with you, and that means I am 20 inches away from the biggest and most important story any reporter has ever heard. This is the kind of story that will change the world. You know that already, Homer. I know it too. Who knows, maybe I really will start hearing what the red mouth says. I probably will, because I think I'm starting to get you, to see things the way you see them. However, right now, at this moment, I'm trying to understand the whole story. That's what I want from you, Homer. I want you to tell me everything so I can report the biggest story in history. And that's the truth, Homer. That's the God's honest truth." It was 5 whole miles before Homer spoke. Up ahead, barely visible in the rain, was a 7-Eleven with its lights on. Homer drummed his fingers on the knobbed leather of the steering wheel. "You want to understand me, son? Fine. That makes sense to me. You saw some of my truth back there at the Starbucks. Now bear witness to more of it." "What do you mean?" "I mean that the red mouth is hungry, and it will not be denied." Homer pulled the Escalade off the road and slid into a slot. There were 2 cars outside. One was a beat-up old Chevy. The other was a Lexus SUV. "What? I mean, Jesus, are you? Homer laughed. "Yeah," he said. "That's exactly what I'm going to do. How's that for a big new story?" He got out and took the keys with him, then leaned in through the open door. "Make sure you film it, too. Every damn bit of it." Homer slammed the door and headed toward the store. Goat did not try to run. He never even opened the door. Instead, he raised the camera, adjusted the zoom, rolled down the window, and filmed everything as Homer Gibbon opened the front door of the convenience store, strode in, and showed everyone what the black eye saw, and let them hear the secrets whispered by the red mouth. Chapter 76. Stebbins Little School, Stebbins, Pennsylvania. Des laid it out for them. The military's withdrawal, the fuel air bombs, the burned dead, and the vulnerability of the school. "If we stay, we risk a siege," she concluded. "God only knows how many of these things there are, and I sure as shit don't want to find out. We need to get out now while we still have a chance." "How do you propose to do it?" asked Piper, following a cue Trout had given him. Des pointed over their heads. "Buses. There are more than enough school buses to get us all out of here. We need to clear out any bodies, hose the insides down to prevent infection, and then load the kids and as many supplies as we can take." "And go where?" asked one of the parents. Pittsburgh," said Des, "or Philadelphia, any of the big cities, anywhere we can get the right kind of help and protection." "But those things are out there," said Clark. "Sure, some of them. At last check, there were 18 that we could see. We have enough weapons to take them out." The crowd murmured at that. Taking them out sounded easy when stated in flat and antiseptic words, but every one of the people outside was a neighbor or a relative. "We can't just kill them," said a thin woman with watery eyes. Des walked over and put her hand on the woman's shoulder. "Dottie, those people are already dead. You know that. We all know that. The kids in here are alive. We're alive. And if we want to stay that way, then we have to square this all in our heads. This isn't a bunch of people with the flu. They're dead. They're infected by something that makes them move, but they're dead." She paused. "Besides, considering what's happened to them, putting them down would be a mercy." "Amen," said Uriah Piper. A few of the others murmured agreement. Des patted Dottie and then turned to the rest of the crowd. She explained what she wanted done and separated people into teams. Not everyone liked the idea. The strongest objections came from Clark, the teacher who had mouthed off earlier. He wanted them all to stay right there in the school. His logic was that if there was a problem like flooded roads or military roadblocks, some might get out rather than all being stopped. "No," said Des firmly. "We all go together." "And what if we don't want to go anywhere?" demanded Clark. "You can stay, Clark," said Des, leaning on that word. "Doesn't matter to me, but the kids are coming with me, and I need enough adults to drive buses and handle guns." Most of the crowd looked uncertain, but there were murmurs and nods, a few clear votes of support. However, Clark stood his ground. "Who are you, of all people, to say what happens with the kids?" She got up in his face. "What's that supposed to mean?" Clark stood his ground. "Well, let's face it, Officer Fox, you're not exactly a role model. How many times have I seen you staggering drunk coming out of one shithole bar or another? How many times have you been reprimanded for excessive force? Yeah, I know about that stuff. My sister, Bitsy, was on the town council. I know all about you. You're a loudmouth and, what do they call it in the movies? A loose cannon. That's it. Exactly why is it we're supposed to listen to you or follow your orders?" Trout saw the dangerous red climb up Des's throat and bloom on her cheeks. "That's enough, Clark," he said. Clark wheeled on him. "Oh, right. And we should listen to you, too. Mr. Lie from the Apocalypse. Mr. Give me a Pulitzer because I have innocent blood on my polo shirt. Fuck you. You turned this whole thing into a story because, like all reporters, if it bleeds, it leads, right? I'll bet that when all those bullets were flying and the kids were screaming, you probably had a hard on just thinking about how big a story this was. Well, excuse me all the hell, Billy, but I don't think you have a real stake in this. You don't have any kids here. We do. Or we're charged with taking care of these kids. They're only a story to you. Besides, everyone in town knows that you've been banging Des Fox since high school, so this is the two of you in cahoots." Billy Trout snarled like a dog and swung a skullcracker of a punch at the point of Clark's jaw. Clark leaned back with the ease of a trained boxer and let the punch pass. Then he hooked Trout in the gut with a fist that he buried deep in belly flesh above Trout's belt buckle. Clark pivoted and clopped Trout behind the ear with a right that put him flat on the floor. Trout was so shocked and hurt that he couldn't even break his fall. He fell flat on his chest and threw up. There was a click and a blur of movement, and then Clark was against the wall with Des's pistol barrel screwed into the soft palate under his chin. "You miserable cocksucker," she hissed. "I'm gonna blow your shit all over the—" "No." The word was snapped out, sharp and full of cold command. Then Uriah Piper moved into Des's peripheral vision. His face was hard as stone. "Put the gun down," he said. Des and he locked eyes. "Now," said Piper. On the floor, Trout made a sound like a strangling cat. With great reluctance, Des stepped back and lowered her gun. "Put it away," suggested Piper. She did. "Now, see to your friend there. He doesn't look good." She slammed her Glock into its holster. Clark, who, despite having had a gun pointed at him, managed to sneer with open contempt. Des sank to her knees and pulled Billy's head onto her lap. His face was the color of an overripe eggplant, and he was only able to breathe in small gasps. He made little yeep sounds. Des wiped the vomit from his face and held him. Her eyes never left Clark, and she hoped he could read his future in those eyes. Uriah Piper, his voice and manner calm, stepped between Des and Clark as if wanting to break that line of communication. But the action forced Clark to shift his attention to the laconic farmer. "You handle yourself pretty well, Clark. You box?" "Sure, so what?" "So did I," said Piper. And without warning, he hit Clark with a short jab that exploded his nose and a right cross that put him on the floor right next to Billy Trout. Both punches were so hard and so fast that they looked and sounded like a single blow. Everyone stared in sudden, intense shock. Clark lay there, nose and mouth streaming with bright blood. Des Fox gaped. Even Trout focused his bulging eyes on the quiet farmer. Piper looked at his knuckles, spit on them, rubbed the spit into the calluses, sighed, and then seemed to slowly become aware of the crowd. He said nothing to them, but he squatted down next to Clark. "Here's the thing, my friend," he said mildly. "Some people never want to be part of the solution. All they want to do is bitch and whine and create complications for other people. You've been like that as long as I've known you, and that's going on 20 years. Since what? Little League? I don't remember you ever once stepping up and helping without running your mouth. Mostly that's okay. That's people being people. And it didn't matter much to anyone. Now it does matter. Now we got to work together or we all get hurt or get killed. Now, I'm no fan of Officer Fox, and I've barely known Mr. Trout outside of what he writes in the papers, so this isn't me sticking up for my friends. This is me, a farmer and a part of this community, saying that if you don't shut your mouth and work with us, then by the Lord Jesus, when we roll out of here on those buses, I will personally tie you to the front grill, cover you with A1 sauce, and use you for bait. Look me in the eye and ask me if I'm joking." No one said a word. Certainly not Clark, who stared at him with eyes that were filled with fear and strange lights. Piper dug a clean tissue out of his pocket and held it out. When Clark made no move to take it, the farmer bent and placed it on his chest, patted it flat, then straightened. He turned and looked down at Des and Trout. "My guess is that we don't have a whole lot of time," he said. "Probably be best if we got our behinds into gear." Chapter 77. The Situation Room, the White House, Washington, D.C. The Situation Room was crammed with too many people, and everyone was shouting at each other, into phones. Some, apparently, at God. All National Guardsmen in the area had been deployed. Additional troops from joint use bases were rolling, and the ban on interaction with state and local law enforcement had been lifted. In each of his many phone calls, General Burroughs used the phrase, "This is all boots on the ground." The Air Force was actively in play now, as were fighters and helicopters from the Marines and Navy. Scott Blair took or made more calls than he could count. FEMA and all other disaster response groups were being pressed to their limits. Teams from the CDC were on the ground, but they were being shunted to the side because there was nothing for them to do. Plenty of samples of living and terminated infected had been collected. They had gallons of the black blood, and more samples were being flown to labs all over the country. Everyone with a microscope was studying Lucifer 113. Nobody had an answer. Then Blair's phone rang, and the display told him that it was Sammy Mora. Blair snatched it up and cupped his other hand over his ear so he could hear. "Tell me some good goddamn news, Sam. Tell me you have the flash drives in your hand. Tell me what I need to hear." Sam didn't. Instead, he told the truth. Chapter 78. Stebbins Little School, Stebbins, Pennsylvania. Billy Trout felt like death. Since yesterday, he had been slapped, punched, shoved, shot at, attacked by zombies, nearly gunned down by helicopters, pulled his back out, and punched some more. There was no part of his body that did not hurt. His stomach felt like it was filled with broken glass, and he had a persistent ringing in his ear. Nausea eddied in his gut, and his eyes had trouble focusing. He felt 90 years old as he limped slowly after Des as she trotted down the hall toward the rear exit. Finally, he had to stop and lean against the wall, gulping in ragged lungfuls of air. When Des realized he wasn't following her, she stopped and turned. "What are you doing?" "Watching all the pretty fireflies," he croaked. He expected a sharp comeback, but instead she came back to where he stood, an expression of concern clouding her pretty face. She smoothed the lank blonde hair out of his eyes and placed her palm on his cheek. An act of tenderness that was an echo of a Des Fox that Trout used to know. "I should have cut his balls off and fed them to him," she said. Trout managed a weak grin. "I'd have enjoyed that." She grunted and smiled. "Piper rang his chimes pretty well, though. Who'd have thought? Wish I'd seen it." "It was sweet." "Sure." Trout straightened slowly and then hissed sharply, collapsing back against the wall. "Jesus Christ, Billy, how fucked up are you?" "Oh, I've had worse." "No, you haven't, you asshole." "No, I haven't," he agreed weakly. "It's the sort of thing people say." "Is it bad?" "It's not terrific," he admitted through clenched teeth. She shook her head. "We need to get you to a hospital." He slowly straightened again, face set against pain spikes. He made it to a relatively upright position. "On the list of immediate priorities, Des. That's right near the bottom." Des didn't argue. "Come on," he said. "We have work to—" "Officer Fox!" a voice called sharply, and they both looked toward the stairwell as Jenny DeGroot came bursting out. "Something's happening outside." "We already know about the soldiers leaving." "No," said Jenny breathlessly. "It's something else. You'd better come look." Des cut a look at Trout, but he waved her away. "Go. I'll catch up." Des followed Jenny into the stairwell, and Trout could hear their footfalls as they raced up to the second floor. The thought of climbing stairs was intimidating, but Trout forced himself to stagger into the fire tower and climb the stone steps, one at a time. It felt like it took 100 years, and the version of Trout that emerged from the tower was hobbled and hunched and gasping for breath. Des Fox nearly ran him down as she tore back toward the stairs. "What?" he gasped as he flung himself out of her way. "The soldiers," she said. "They're back." She took off running with Jenny and a few of the others at her heels. Trout didn't immediately follow. He couldn't face the steps, not yet. Instead, he limped over to one of the classrooms, went inside, and peered out the window. Down in the lot, a pair of soldiers was walking purposefully toward the school. They wore dark hazmat suits and had guns in their hands. They stopped at the corner of the building, and one of them raised a walkie-talkie and spoke into it for a moment, listened, then lowered the device. Then, weapons raised and ready, they began walking slowly along the east side of the building. Were they walking the perimeter or looking for a way in? A sudden and alarming thought jolted Trout. Where exactly was Des hurrying to? He thought he knew the answer, and it scared him to death. He set his teeth against the pane and hobbled toward the stairs as fast as he could. Chapter 79. The Northern Levee, Fayette County. On the other side of the county from his niece, Jake DeGroot wondered if he was dead. Everyone else seemed to be. Jake was a construction worker from Bordentown who volunteered to work all night in Stebbins, and he and his crew had been at it for nearly 24 hours. Until everything went crazy in Stebbins, just over the county line. Now he lay in a shallow pit, half-drowned, shivering and terrified, hidden from view beneath the lowered bucket of a yellow front-end loader. His machine, the one he drove every day. Big Bird. Rain hammered down on the machine. The bucket was half filled with dirt from the trench in which he lay, and water filled the rest of the steel cup. It spilled over and ran down the sides, dripping onto him, touching him with cold fingertips. Rainwater had filled the pit nearly to the top, and the cold was like 1,000 knives stabbing over and over again into his flesh. He could barely feel his feet, and his fingers felt like they were each being crushed in a vise. Cold was a beast that crouched over him, wrapped around him, bit like a vampire into him, and sucked away his warmth. Jake was afraid to crawl out of the dirty pit of cold water. He had no idea what time it was. His cell phone was in his pocket, and his pocket was underwater. The only other clocks were the one in the office, a small travel trailer parked at the edge of the construction site that might as well have been on the dark side of the moon, and the steel diver's watch strapped to the forearm of Burl Hansard, the shift foreman. Burl lay 30 feet away, what was left of him. His body was mostly hidden by mud and the front wheel of Burl's Expedition. All Jake could see was half of Burl's face, his shoulder, and his right arm. Or rather, what was left of the supervisor's right arm. 2 fingers and a thumb, some meat on the wrist, part of the upper arm. Tendons and bone, visible now that the rain had washed away the blood. That was it. And the face. He had no face at all. All Jake could see were the ends of broken bones and lumps of meat he could not and would not try to identify. Jake lay there, shivering, staring at his dead friend. 2 hours ago, that ruined face had worn a smile. 2 hours ago, a soggy cigar had been clamped between strong white teeth, and a grin curled the lips. Burl had been that kind of a guy. You couldn't depress the son of a bitch. No matter how bad things were, he could find something to crack a joke about. He'd always get people to laugh at funerals, even the family members. He killed them when he gave a toast at the Union Christmas dinners. Tall, but nowhere near as tall as Jake's 6'8", and built like a cannonball on bowed legs. A John Goodman kind of guy, bigger than life in every way. And smiling, always smiling, no matter how bad the shit was coming down, or how late an emergency shift went, or how tough a job was, always laughing. Until 3 teenage girls came out of the woods and ate the smile off his face. The thought, the memory was so insanely vivid, playing in his head in HD with surround sound. All the colors, all the sounds. They had been out here working the storm because the weather service said this was going to be a nutbuster, a hurricane, or whatever you call a storm like that this far inland. A supercell, something like that. Torrential rains, hurricane-force winds, and an absolute guarantee of flash flood. This was the storm, everyone said, that would finally break the levees. Everyone always said that. They were always wrong. Until they were right. Until today. Jake and his crew were at it before the sun was even up yesterday morning, and they kept at it all the way past midnight, working with bulldozers and front-end loaders, including his own big Caterpillar 950H, the one under which he lay. The crew were hard at it all damn day, pushing hundreds of tons of dirt into berms to reinforce the levees, cutting rain runoff lines, trying to help the town get ready for the storm. They needed 5 times as many men and machines on the job, but they used what they had. Did some good, too. The levees held north of the town proper, which is where everyone said the water would do the most damage. Jake and the guys saved maybe 50, 60 farms from being flooded by dirty river water. Below the town line, though, the National Guard was supposed to be doing the same job, and they had more equipment. But then Magic Marty on the radio said that the levees had collapsed down there. Jake never got all the details, though. Not on that, and not on whatever the Christ else was happening over there in Stebbins. Even with headphones on, between the rain and the engine roars, it was too loud to hear much of the news, and reception was for shit. He lost Magic Marty, whose radio show on WNOW came up from over the Maryland line, and when he had the chance, Jake tried to pick up the network news out of Pittsburgh. Got a little of it, but the news guy seemed to be losing his shit. Typical news people, he thought at the time. They go ass wild whenever things get really bad, so instead of reporting the news, they act like the news is all about them. Like Anderson Cooper standing in the fucking wind during Katrina. They shout a lot, so you know they're taking the big risk, but they don't say much of anything people can use. Like today. Nobody seemed to know what in the blue hell was going on. Certainly no one on the stations Jake listened to when he could get a signal, and no one he talked to. Lots of cars went by, but everyone was driving so fast you'd have thought the devil was after them. Then those 3 girls came out of the woods. Jake saw them, and he was so startled that he almost ran his bucket through the berm he was building. He jerked to a stop to watch. The girls came walking slowly out of the woods, like there was no crisis, no storm, no goddamn ocean of water pounding down on them. And damn if one of them wasn't naked. These were high school girls, or maybe college. The one on the left wore jeans and a torn sweatshirt, the flaps of it hanging down to expose a blue sports bra and pale skin. The one on the right had a windbreaker on with the logo of some sports team Jake had never heard of. Probably a school team. But the one in the middle was as naked as if she was taking a shower instead of walking through the woods where everyone could see her. She was thin, with tiny breasts and visible ribs. Jake had 2 reactions. The guy in him immediately checked out her body. The man in him became instantly concerned. She was young, naked, vulnerable, and clearly out of her mind. Drugs? Something else? All 3 of the girls had marks on them that looked like cuts, but the distance and the cleansing rain made the marks look blue and bloodless. The girls came straight across a muddy field, negotiating the uneven terrain where heavy equipment wheels had created an obstacle course of wheel ruts. One by one, the other guys killed their engines. They all stared. A few of the men were smiling, and one clown whistled, but the sound was shrill and it died in the air. And these kids were clearly in trouble. That bullshit about construction crews sitting around whistling and acting like they had dicks instead of brains may be true sometimes, but nearly every man here had a family, kids. Burl was the first guy to do more than sit there and gape. "Yo!" he cried as he jumped down from the cab of his Cat D9. "Yo, kids! What the hell's going on? You girls okay? What are you doing out here?" He kept up a string of questions as he jogged heavily through the mud to intercept them. The girls paused for a moment, just a moment, as he drew close, and it seemed to Jake that in the cold and misty rain they'd been unaware of him until he spoke, until he moved. He thought that then, and knew it now. The girls all smiled at him, grinning to show white teeth. Then they broke into a run to meet Burl, arms outstretched, like children running to the safety of their daddy's arms. Except that wasn't what it was. Of course it wasn't. Even with fractured logic, even if things weren't what they were, that wouldn't have been the way it was. Maybe Burl knew it too, Jake thought. Knew it a step too late, because as he got close to them his own pace faltered and his voice trailed away, ending on a rising note of question. The girls answered that question by leaping at him, driving him backward, driving him down to the ground, climbing all over Burl, bending toward him. In a damaged guy's fantasy world, that would have been a Penthouse Letters page 3-on-1. But this was the real world, and naked teenage girls didn't walk out of the rain to bang a fat construction worker. That's not what they did. For a moment, though, Jake didn't understand what they were doing. From a distance, it really did look like they were kissing him. His face, his throat, their hands were all over him. And then the screaming started. So high. Jake would never have guessed that a man as big as Burl could scream so loud, so high, so shrill, like a whistle blowing at the end of a shift. A long, sustained blast that went on as the girls' mouths bent to him over and over again. Everyone started screaming then. All four of the other guys and Jake screamed as they started running toward the tangle of white limbs that were now streaked with bright, bright red. The first one there was Richie, another bulldozer jockey. He ran up like he was going to handle this shit right there, right then. But when he was 20 feet out, his nothing-can-stop-me run slowed to a walk as he saw what was actually happening. His screams went up a notch, from man yell to something younger, higher, and more frightened. The three girls raised their heads and snarled at him, like lionesses around a zebra. Jake was 50 yards back, and he could see strings of meat caught between their teeth, swaying as they looked at Richie. Then two of them came off the ground and rushed him. It was so unexpected. Not really fast. It was awkward and even a little slow. But there was absolutely no hesitation. One moment they were looking at Richie, and the next minute they were at him, just like that. Richie skidded to a stop and tried to backpedal, but the mud was too wet. He went down hard, and the girls were on him. Once more the screams changed into something raw and filled with denial. The other guys were there, Hank and Tommy and Vic. Jake was almost there. He'd been farthest away. They grabbed the girls, shoved them, knocked them back. The girls turned on them. Their faces were smeared with blood that was so thick the downpour couldn't wash it off. Everyone was wrestling, struggling. It was crazy. All those big men, 3 teenage girls, none of them bigger than 110. The blood. All that blood. Jake stepped down wrong and sank to mid-shin in watery mud. Pain detonated in his knee, and for a terrible moment he thought he had broken his leg. But it was just jammed straight. Maybe sprained. It stopped him cold, though, and pitched him face forward into the mud. It went straight up his nose, into his eyes, into his screaming mouth, down his throat. He coughed and gagged and blew, pawing at his face, trying to unclog his nostrils and mouth so he could drag in a breath. Swallowed more mud doing that, and a worse spasm of coughing nearly tore him apart. His chest convulsed, and he vomited mud and coffee and 2 Egg McMuffins into the storm, and the fierce wind blew it back into his face. For a long, twisted time he lay there, dripping with mud and puke, trying to breathe, failing, trying, until black fireworks exploded in his head and the sounds of the rain dwindled into a distant buzz, and Jake knew that he was choking to death, right there, while his friends fought little girls and screamed and bled. Desperate, terrified, Jake balled his right fist and punched himself in the solar plexus as hard as he could. It felt like being shot, but a ball of something, bread or Canadian bacon or mud or all of that, shot from his mouth and vanished into the rain. He dragged in half the air in the world. The flesh around his eyes tingled and the world was incredibly bright but filled with fireflies. Then the wind brought the screams back to him. That was how the day started for Jake DeGroot. It was the best part of his day. It got so much worse after that. Chapter 80. Stebbins Little School, Stebbins, Pennsylvania. Des Fox made no sound at all as she opened the small door that connected the teacher's lounge to the corner of the schoolyard. The wind screeched through the chain-link fence, and rain hit the concrete so steadily it sounded like white noise. Des took several small, quick steps, her feet barely lifting from the ground as she moved up behind two of the patrolling soldiers. They were 20 feet ahead of her, walking at a measured pace, heading to the turn at the far end. They carried their M4s at an angle to keep rain from filling the barrels. Even though both of them wore gray-green hazmat suits, Des could tell that one was male and the other female. Des stopped behind a decorative outcropping of red brick and racked the slide of her Daewoo shotgun. Even with the storm, it was a loud and distinctive sound, and she'd waited until she was in a position so the soldiers could hear it. She yelled, "Freeze right fucking there!" They froze. Right there. "Unsling your rifles and stand them against the wall," Des ordered. "Do it now!" The soldiers hesitated, and the woman started to turn. "Don't make a stupid mistake, girl," warned Des. "You're the one making a mistake," said the female soldier. "And I'll cry about it later. Drop the guns or I'll drop you. Last warning." The soldiers exchanged a brief look. Then they slid the straps from their shoulders and very gingerly stood their weapons against the wall. "Place your hands on top of your heads, fingers laced. Good. Now, turn around slowly. Fuck with me and I will kill you." They did exactly as told, and though Des couldn't see their faces behind the masks they wore, each of them stiffened in surprise. Des smiled as she stepped away from the wall. Behind her, Uriah Piper and 8 other men, each of them experienced deep woods hunters, knelt in the rain in a shooting line with rifles snugged against their shoulders. A sound made the soldiers look up to see 8 more gun barrels, small arms and long guns, pointing at them from half-opened windows. "Yeah," said Des to the soldiers. "You're that fucked." For a long moment there was no sound except the dull impact of raindrops on brick and pavement and clothing and skin. Des lowered her shotgun and walked over to the soldiers. "Jenny!" she called, and Jenny DeGroot trotted out of the building holding a plastic trash can. Then Des began stripping weapons and equipment from the soldiers. Grenades, walkie-talkies, knives, IFAC first aid kits, ammunition, canteens, equipment belt suspenders, gun belts, and the rest, until each soldier wore only their hazmat suit and their battle dress uniform beneath it. All of it went into the plastic trash can until Jenny staggered under the weight. "Take it inside. Uriah, get their rifles." "Do you have any idea what you're doing, Officer Fox?" asked the female soldier. Des wasn't surprised to hear her name. She was the only police officer left alive in Stebbins, and her presence in the school was certainly known to the military. Even so, she didn't like hearing this woman say it. She produced 2 sets of plastic flex cuffs, handed her shotgun to Piper, spun the female soldier roughly around, yanked her wrists down behind her, and quickly fitted the cuffs around the wrists. She repeated this with the man who had so far kept silent. "This isn't how you want to play this," warned the woman. Des tore off the woman's goggles and yanked down the cowl of her hazmat suit. The woman had olive skin, short black hair, and dark eyes. She did not look even remotely afraid of Des or the guns pointed at her, which was very strange. The woman was also older than Des expected, maybe 33, with crow's feet at the corner of her eyes and laugh lines etched around her mouth. "Listen, sister," said Des. "You think I'm making a mistake here? Are you really that stupid? You're only making more trouble for yourself. What do you hope to accomplish?" Des wiped rainwater from her eyes. "What do I hope to accomplish?" she echoed. "Sure, fair question. I'll tell you, and maybe it'll even sink in." She pointed to the school. "There are 800 people in there. Most of them are scared little kids. None of them are infected." The woman nodded. "And?" Des almost smiled at how cool this woman was. Cuffed and captured, she was keeping everything in neutral. Des wasn't sure whether to be impressed or nervous. "The other reason is that we need some insurance that General Zetter won't bomb this place. He might be willing to kill civilians, but I don't think he'll pull the trigger on his own people." "Are you sure about that?" "No," admitted Des. "But fuck it. You play the cards you're dealt." The woman studied her, then nodded. "Fair enough. However, I don't work for General Zetter. He doesn't know my name or my partner's name, and he has no idea that you and I are having this conversation." "Bullshit. If you're not with Zetter, what are you? Regular army? Who are you working for?" "His name is Captain Sammy Mora," said the woman. "Hurt either of us, and he will blow your head off." "Oh, that's mighty tough fucking talk, but I don't—" "Des," said Trout suddenly. "Oh, God, Des!" She looked at him, and then down at her chest. There, between her breasts, right over her heart, was a tiny red dot. It quivered ever so slightly. A laser sight. She stood facing the soldier, which meant that someone out there in the storm was aiming a rifle at her. Someone hidden by rain and the humped shapes of buses and cars. Des shifted her shotgun so the barrel pointed at the woman's face. She took a breath and yelled loud enough to be heard above the rain. "Take your shot, motherfucker! I'll blow this slut's shit all over the wall before I go down." "Officer Fox," said the woman calmly, "this isn't about you." Suddenly 2 more laser dots appeared. One was on Uriah Piper's chest. The other moved in a slow line up Billy Trout's body, over his chest, across his face, and stopped exactly between his eyebrows. This dot did not quiver at all. "Captain Imura was one of the top 3 snipers in U.S. Special Forces. The other 2 men are superb shots, and they are in positions of concealment. They can drop 9 of your people in under 4 seconds, including you." "I'm not afraid to die," sneered Des. "If we wanted you dead, Officer Fox, we'd have taken you as soon as you stepped outside of the building. This isn't about who's brave enough to die. It's about who's smart enough to live." Chapter 81. On the Road, Pittsburgh Suburbs. Goat whimpered when he saw what Homer Gibbon did inside the 7-Eleven. However, he kept the camera rolling. There were 5 people there, a family of 3, a man who dressed like a bartender, and the young man working the cash register. The store's employee lay where he had been dropped, his chest on the floor and his feet still hooked on the counter. That's how it had started. Homer walked in, reached over the counter, grabbed the kid, dragged him up, and took a bite out of his throat. Then Homer dropped him. The other people in the store screamed and panicked. The woman pushed her 10-year-old son behind her as she backed into an aisle. Her husband tried to drag Homer off the cashier. Homer wheeled on him and drove a savage kick into the man's crotch that sent him crashing into a display of chips and pretzels. The other man, the bartender, apparently knew some karate because Goat saw him throw his own kick, catching Homer in the gut. The blow staggered Homer, but the killer folded around the bartender's leg, clutching it to the point of impact. He bent all the way over it, and Goat suddenly realized that he was bending to take a bite. The bartender screamed and pounded on Homer to let go. Homer did, abruptly. He whipped the trapped leg up into the air, which caused the bartender to flip backward. He crashed down on the wire rack, scattering brightly colored bags of Utz pretzels, Lay's potato chips, and Snyder barbecue pork rinds. The man lay there, back arched over the twisted wire, writhing and hissing between gritted teeth. That's when the woman began throwing things at Homer. Cans of Spam and Campbell's soup struck the killer's back and shoulders. He threw an arm up to protect his face as he waded toward her. He never once stopped grinning. Homer was as dead as the other monsters, but he wasn't like them. Not entirely. Because he was the first infected person in this plague, because the purest form of Dr. Volker's Lucifer 113 pathogen had been directly injected into his veins, the parasitic reaction was different. His mind did not die along with his flesh. Goat knew this, understood it, and it terrified him. It made Homer into a kind of monster that was so much greater, so much more dangerous than anything else. Goat watched Homer grin, heard him laugh as he swatted the cans out of the air like someone playing a game. A game. It was a mercy for Goat, not for the woman and her child, that Homer tackled them and they vanished between the aisles. Blood shot upward, though, spattering the top rows of canned goods and stacks of plastic-wrapped Stroman bread. Goat never once looked at the door handle. He never once seriously thought about running. He understood that he was trapped inside this drama and that there was no exit cue on his script. After several minutes, Homer rose from between the rows, his face painted with a new coat of red. He wiped his mouth, though he was still chewing something. He looked across the bloody tops of the bread toward the window and through the glass to where Goat sat behind the dispassionate camera. And he gave Goat a cheery, buddy-buddy thumbs up, like a football jock after a successful play. The bartender was struggling to rise, but Homer stepped over him and walked in a casual swagger toward the door. Then he paused, turned, went to the cooler, and took out 2 cold bottles of Coke and plucked a handful of candy bars from the rack. He nodded to himself and left the store. When he opened the driver's door, he held the Coke and candy out to Goat. "Guess you gotta eat too," he said. It took a lot for Goat to accept these things. It cost him an expensive chunk of his soul. Homer got behind the wheel and started the car. Inside the store, the mother and child, both of whom had been savaged, were on their feet. Her husband was only now struggling to his feet, his hands still cupped around his crotch, face purple with agony. Goat had never seen a man kicked that hard in the groin before, and from the awkward way the man stood, it seemed obvious that bones had to have been broken. He raised his head toward his family and screamed as they rushed toward him, reaching for him with bloody hands. He fell beneath them, and Goat turned away. "No!" barked Homer, hitting him hard on the shoulder. "You don't look away! You fucking well look!" It cost Goat another part of his soul to turn back, to witness another death, and another resurrection. The cashier was rising too, scrambling toward the bartender with the bitten leg. More blood, more screams. "There," said Homer.
There it is.
What?
That's the secret the red mouth wants you to know. The black eye wants to open in the center of your forehead so you can see. You can see it, can't you?
I see it.
Glad to hear it. I was beginning to have my doubts about you, son.
He tapped the video camera.
Did you get everything like I asked?
Yes.
You'll put it on the net?
As soon as we get somewhere with a Wi-Fi. Homer grunted, a note of deep satisfaction, perhaps of relief.
Good,
he said. He pulled back onto the highway and headed toward Pittsburgh. Chapter 82. The Northern Levees, Fayette County.
Please God.
Jake DeGroot prayed nearly continually, but he prayed under his breath. He didn't dare make a sound, in case someone could hear. He didn't want anyone to hear him. Not the things that had pretended to be teenaged girls, the things that had done those awful things to Burl and Richie and the others. He was sure they were dead. He just wasn't sure that it mattered. After the attack had started, if attack was even the right word, Jake had been down in the mud for too long. When he had fallen face first into the muck and choked on it and on his breakfast, getting his shit together took a long damn time. Lying there, gasping like a gaffed billfish, his legs screaming at him, his chest on fire, he had no strength at all. Not for a long time. Too long. Maybe. Or long enough. It was all a matter of how you looked at it. Since then, hiding in the ditch under Big Bird, he had thought about it a lot. He thought it all the way through as the HD TV in his head played and replayed it. There was no remote to aim at it and surf away to something better and saner, to something that made any kind of sense. Before Jake could struggle back to his feet, the whole thing with Burl and Hank and the others seemed to have changed, to have ended in a way Jake didn't understand. The other three guys, Hank, Tommy, and Vic, had pulled the girls off of Burl and Richie. Pulled them off, fought with them, fell to the ground wrestling with them, and beaten the shit out of them. Through pain-filled eyes, Jake watched the guys punching and stomping the girls. It was surreal, like something out of a bad movie, like snuff porn. Except that this was real, and no matter how many times his friends hit the girls, they couldn't put them down. Not down so they'd stay. First, one girl would fall, knocked into the mud by a fist or foot, then another, but then they'd get right back up, with faces broken to ugliness by the blows, with teeth sliding out of their mouths on tides of black blood, with the white ends of ribs coming through their skin and broken fingers. They'd go right after the guys again, and again, and again, until Tommy knocked one of them down and stomped on her head. But it took 5 or 10 kicks. At first, all he did was drive the girl with the torn sweatshirt deeper into the mud. Tommy was bleeding from 6 bites on his hands and wrists. Then one of his kicks must have done something worse. Broke her head, maybe, or her neck, something, because she suddenly stopped fighting, stopped trying to get up, stopped everything. Tommy staggered back, staring down at her, his face as slack as if he had been slapped, eyes bugged. Jake could understand that. The craziness of the attack, the bites and the blood, and what he had just done. How could they ever explain this? All these big guys and 3 teenage girls, one of them naked, another with her shirt torn open and her bra showing, beaten to shit so they didn't even look like girls anymore. What could any of them ever say that would make sense of that? What? What? Tommy stood there and looked down at the girl while the other guys kept rolling around, fighting. Then Tommy spun away, dropped to his knees, and threw up. Jake was still trying to haul himself out of the mud, still trying to remember how to breathe. He fought to get to his feet, but his knee immediately buckled and he went down again. That's when Burl got up. The naked girl had left him in the mud and was fighting Richie. Hank and Vic were taking turns knocking down the girl in the windbreaker and getting bit and knocking her down again, all of them screaming and cursing. Jake began to crawl through the mud, while across the rainy field, behind the 5 struggling figures, Burl Hansard stood up. It seemed to take a long time for him to do it. He was so badly hurt, maybe so dazed that he was clumsy. He looked like he was drunk. The rain slashed at him, sending crooked red lines down to the mud, making his skin look white as paper. "Burl!" called Jake. But he was too far away, and his voice was lost in the sound of the storms and all that yelling. Burl paused for one moment, his pale face turned toward Jake, eyes locked. And in that fragment of time, Jake knew that everything here was wrong. Worse even than it had been. He didn't know how he knew. It was a reaction born in the deepest, oldest, most primitive part of his brain. It was a knowledge of wrongness without any intellectual interpretation. It was simply wrong. Burl's eyes were open, but Burl was not in there. Even from that distance, Jake knew. Somehow, Burl was gone. So who looked at him from his friend's eyes? Who or what? All of this burned through Jake's head in less than a second. Then Burl took a step, heavy, lumbering, like he didn't quite remember how to use his feet. He pulled one work boot out of the mud and took a step, but it was more like falling forward than walking forward. Not toward Jake. Burl turned toward the knot of struggling figures. A step. Another. He reached out to help pull the naked girl away, who kept trying to bite Vic, even though he had her by the hair and kept punching her in the face. Burl grabbed the girl and hauled her away, and Jake expected him to start wailing on her, but he didn't. Instead, he simply shoved her aside, and with a rush and a yell that was as loud as it was meaningless, Burl grabbed Vic's face, taking it in both of his hands the way a grandmother does when she's going to kiss a kid on the lips. Except that's not what was happening. Of course it wasn't. Burl pulled Vic forward, tearing him free from the mud, crushing him close, and then he bit down, tearing into Vic's nose, crushing it, ripping it. Blood exploded against Burl's face, and it seemed to incense the man. He growled like a dog and began tearing at Vic, worrying at his face the way a dog does. Vic screamed and screamed. He beat at Burl, punching him with the same red, swollen fists he had been using with similar futility on the naked girl. The fists bounced off of Burl's massive frame. Vic brought his knee up into Burl's balls, once, again, and again. Nothing. And it was then, at that moment, that Jake lost all hope that there was any way to understand this. He'd been in fights. He'd given and taken shots to the groin. Some guys could cowboy through it, biting down on the pain, bullying through it, but even the toughest of them reacted. You had to react. It was your balls. Burl didn't twitch. All that happened was a jerk of his body with each impact, but there was no more reaction to it than when somebody brushes your shoulder on the subway. Less. It was nothing. Dead meat being hit. That was it. That was all. Burl never stopped biting. Vic's face, Vic's cheek, Vic's throat. Then Vic stopped screaming. He stopped kicking. Someone turned on a power hose of red in Vic's throat. Blood showered Burl's face and chest. Jake lost it then. He could hear past his own screams. His eyes seemed to switch off for a moment, as if they refused to see any of this. Time punched him senseless, and each second was like a brutal fist against his brain. The sounds and sights of what was going on broke apart and flew off into the storm. Tommy and Richie were still fighting, one each with a girl. Then Tommy was down, and the girl with the windbreaker knelt on his chest. There was one little final flap of Tommy's hand. After that, nothing. Richie picked the naked girl up and flung her away from him. Then he looked wildly around, as if trying to decide how to react, failed, and then simply ran. Badly. The mud and the rain and the damage brought him down within 2 steps. "No!" The cry was torn from Jake. It was not the first time he had yelled, but this one found a hole in the storm where there was no thunder, no howling wind, no screams. A flash moment of quiet into which his one word stabbed. Every face turned toward the sound. Toward him. Burl and the girls. Even Vic. Oh, God. Vic. He sat up and swiveled his head around on his ruined throat. Richie saw him too, and he reached out with a blood-stained hand. "Jake! Oh, Christ, Jake!" It was a mistake. The girls, broken and disfigured, crippled into shambling wrecks, turned away from Jake and began limping after Richie. He tried to crawl away from them. Didn't. Couldn't. Burl and Vic did not go after Richie. Vic got to his feet and, nearly shoulder to shoulder with Burl, began moving toward Jake. Chapter 83. The Situation Room, the White House, Washington, D.C. "Mr. President," said Scott Blair, "Captain Imura's team is on site at the Stebbins Little School. I'm waiting now on word about the drives." "How soon can Imura get those drives to us?" "He won't need to. He'll upload them to his tactical computer and send them via burst transfer to us. We'll have them 5 minutes after he has them." "Thank God," said the President. "Thank God." Sylvia Ruddy covered the mouthpiece of the phone into which she'd been speaking. "Scott, how much stake are we placing on what's on the drives? I reviewed Trout's broadcasts, and it seemed clear that Volker regarded his variation of Lucifer as unstoppable. He said as much to his CIA handler. I have transcripts of all of this, and there's nothing in anything Volker said to indicate that there's a silver bullet on those drives." Blair placed his hands flat on the table. "Have you not been following, Sylvia? I never said that there was a cure on the drives. We need them for our people. Dr. McCready, Dick Price at Zabriskie Point, the team at the CDC. They are the most talented bioweapons people on Earth. It's always been our hope that they'll find a weakness in Volker's variation." "That's a long damn shot," said Ruddy. "It's the shot we have." The President got up and walked over to the big screen on which the satellite images were shown, with the thermal signatures of hundreds of people scattering through the storm. He touched the screen at the outer edge of the dispersal pattern. "All the science in the world isn't going to help us if we can't contain the outbreak." No one spoke. He nodded to General Burrows. "Armistead, give me the numbers." Burrows punched some keys that overlaid a red circle around the troubled area. "The only thing working in our favor right now is that the infected are unable to drive vehicles, and most of them are slow, moving at a fast walk or slower. So, by estimating the potential distance traveled by foot since the quarantine break, we have extended the Q zone to cover this area." He hit keys, and the line jumped outward so that it covered an area with a 64-mile diameter, with Stebbins in the exact center. Even if an infected person was traveling on foot at a rate of 4 miles an hour, which is virtually impossible because of terrain, weather, and the nature of the infection, we estimate that the maximum distance from Stebbins would be 32 miles. Therefore, we need to designate everything inside this extended area to be our new hot zone. The president nodded very slowly. How many people live inside that zone? Well, it's mostly farm country. How many? It was Blair who had those numbers. It hurt him to say it, though. 170,000 people. The president closed his eyes. However, if it continues to spread at this rate, we'll have to expand the zone again, said Blair. By tomorrow morning, Pittsburgh will be inside the hot zone. The president turned. Ladies and gentlemen, I will take any and all suggestions for how to contain this. As of right now, no option is off the table. Chapter 84. Stebbins Little School, Stebbins, Pennsylvania. 2 of the red laser dots vanished, and a few seconds later, 2 men came walking slowly and carefully out of the rain. They wore the same dark hazmat suits as the other soldiers and carried similar gear. The taller of the newcomers had an M4 in his gloved hands. The other had a sniper rifle. Des recognized it. A .408 Cheyenne tactical sniper rifle that fired .338 Lapua Magnum supersonic rounds. A rifle bullet like that would result in a kill shot no matter where it struck a person. The laser dot on Billy Trout remained where it was, and Dez's heart hammered in her chest. The man with the sniper rifle walked past Uriah Piper and the other farmers, showing a total lack of concern that they all held weapons. He walked right up to Dez, slung his rifle barrel down, raised his goggles onto his forehead, and pulled down his hood to reveal a middle-aged Japanese face. A small mouth, crooked nose, and quiet eyes. Lots of old scars. "Officer Fox?" he asked, his voice mild and surprisingly deep for a man of his size. Thunder boomed like a dramatic counterpoint, and lightning glowed along the edges of his face. Imura raised an eyebrow. "Wow, nice timing. But I promised that I didn't plan the theatrics." Des almost smiled. Didn't. The soldier offered his hand. "Captain Sam Imura." Des did not shake hands. "Get that laser sight off of Billy." "Sure," said Imura, withdrawing his hand. He tapped the electronic bud seated inside his right ear. "Moonshiner, stand down." The red dot vanished. Trout sagged and almost collapsed, but Piper caught him under the armpit and steadied him. Sam Imura looked amused. A 5th soldier, big and broad-shouldered, stepped down from his hiding place in one of the buses. Des stepped very close to Sam. They were the same height, and she gave him the full weight of her anger and disapproval in a blue-eyed glare. "Okay, so now that we're done measuring dicks," she growled, "how about you tell me what the fuck is going on?" "I will," said Sam, "but first I need to know if the flash drives are still safe." "That's why you're here?" "Mostly," said Sam. He glanced at Trout. "Do you have them?" "Don't trust him, Billy," said Cletus, one of the farmers. A few others grunted agreement except for Piper, who stood as silent as a statue. "Why didn't you shoot first and just take the drives?" Trout asked sourly. "3 reasons," said Sam. "First, we're not actually barbarians. I know, big surprise, right? It goes against the cliché, but what can I tell you? Second, if we started a gunfight, do you really think either side would win? We'd kill a bunch of you, and you might kill some of my people. That's pretty crappy math." Trout pointed to the big auditorium windows halfway along the side of the school. That entire section of the school's facade was peppered with thousands of bullet holes, and the windows were totally gone. "You guys seemed happy with that equation a few hours ago." "That wasn't us," said Sam. That was Colonel Dietrich of the Pennsylvania National Guard, who, as I believe you've been told, has been relieved of his command. He was replaced by Major General Zetter, who did not fire on you. He could have, you know. Your Live from the Apocalypse broadcasts are being jammed, so no one would have known if Zetter razed this school to the ground. The fact that he didn't should say something to you." Trout and Des exchanged an uncertain look. "What was the third reason, Captain?" asked Des. "Because if Mr. Trout here is dead and the flash drives are not in his pocket, then I could burn off a lot of time trying to find wherever he hid them." He shrugged. "It's pretty simple, really. The best approach is a straightforward one. So I decided to come and ask." "Except that you walked into an ambush," said one of the farmers. "How smart was that?" "They ambushed us, dumbass," said Des. "Now shut up, Cletus. There are grown folks talking." Even in the cold rain, the man's face flushed red. Sam said, "Mind telling me why you tried to ambush my soldiers? It was my understanding that General Zetter negotiated a truce with you." "Fuck Zetter and fuck you." "There's that," conceded Sam. "We thought he left two assholes behind to keep us penned in. Turns out we don't think it's safe in Stebbins County. Might come as a shock to you." Sam said nothing. "So we were going to tie up Zetter's sentries, take their weapons, and then clear out as many buses as it'll take to get these kids and the rest of the adults the fuck out of this particular ring of hell." "And go where?" "Anywhere but here." "That was the general plan," agreed Trout, "until you showed up. And I have to say, Captain, that you played a very dangerous hand of cards there. We could have just as easily shot your people." "That goes both ways, Mr. Trout, and in any armed conflict I rather like our odds." Des tried to get up in his face. "You can suck my—" Trout pushed her back. "Much as I appreciate you not turning this into the OK Corral, Captain," said Trout, "how about the added courtesy of a few answers? Like, why'd everybody light out of here like their asses were on fire? What was that about?" "Well, you've probably already guessed that this trouble isn't over," said Sam. "The infection, the outbreak, it's not over. And that's why we need your help and cooperation. That's why I need you to give me the flash drives." Trout shifted, wincing at the pain in his body. "How bad is it?" Sam Imura had the kind of face that rarely gave anything away, but Des and Trout could both see dangerous lights flicker in the man's eyes. Beneath the placid veneer of calm, there was real fear there. Deep and intense, barely kept in check. "It's bad," said Sam. "We may not be able to contain it. Mr. Trout, please, those drives may be our only hope of preventing a nationwide catastrophe." Trout sighed deeply and closed his eyes. "What?" asked Sam. "I don't have the drives," said Billy Trout. Sam's face went dead pale. Moonshiner said, "Oh, shit." Chapter 85. Suburbs of Pittsburgh. "Homer," said Goat, after he started the camera again and adjusted the microphone, "why did you attack those people at the 7-Eleven?
"I thought you said you understood."
"I do," Goat said quickly. "But this will go out to millions of people who don't yet understand. You want them to understand, right? That's why we're doing this."
"Sure."
"Then tell them." The rain was intensifying again, so Homer turned up the wiper speed.
"What do you want me to say, exactly?"
"You just walked into a 7-Eleven and killed 5 people. Talk about why you did that." Homer shook his head.
"Is that what you think I did?"
"Didn't you? You attacked everyone, bit them."
"I didn't bite everyone,"
Homer said.
"And I only killed 2 of them, and the red mouth brought them right back. It's funny. In court they went on and on about how many lives they say I took. Maybe that used to be true, but that's before I understood the real power of the red mouth. I wasn't trying to take anything from anyone. I was always trying to give them something. That's why I wanted my lawyer to put me on the stand so I could tell everyone that, so I could explain it. But he wouldn't do it. He said that people wouldn't understand and it would go against me in court. Against me? They fucking executed me. How much more against me could it have gone? I think that if he had let me have my say, if he let me explain what the black eye saw and let me speak with the voice of the red mouth, then they wouldn't have sentenced me to any friggin' lethal injection.
No, thought Goat. They'd have put you in a tiny padded cell and spent the next 40 years experimenting on your brain to see what makes it tick. He did not say this to Homer. The killer kept talking, working it out for the camera.
That's all different now. Thanks to Dr. Volker and the gift he gave me, now I can share that gift with other people. No one's ever going to die. Not really. Not like it used to be. We're all going to live forever.
Goat kept the camera on the killer's profile, capturing the way he nodded in agreement with his own words and thoughts.
In the Bible, Jesus talked about how the meek were going to inherit the earth. I forget where he said it, but it was important. And I think this is what he was talking about. The way people are when they wake up after I open the red mouths in their flesh. They don't act the way they used to. They don't talk. They don't say stupid shit. I'll bet they don't even know if they're Republican or Democrats. They're just people. All the bullshit is gone.
They're zombies, suggested Goat.
Sure, if you want to use that word. But I don't know. Zombies. I always think of black guys with bug eyes in those old movies. Down in Jamaica someplace.
Haiti.
Haiti? Okay, Haiti. Wherever. Those are zombies. Is that what they are?
Dr. Volker said that he studied zombies in Haiti. The witch doctors there use a chemical compound to...
None of that matters. It's what, voodoo? The red mouth isn't voodoo and it's not magic.
Then what is it?
If I tell you, you'll laugh.
Oh, believe me, said Goat. I won't laugh.
It's God stuff. I read a word once in a book, celestial. You know what that means?
Yes.
That's what this is. I know that because it's what Jesus spoke about. It's the meek inheriting the earth. And he knew. Those Romans opened red mouths in his flesh, and he spoke the real truth, and he came back from the dead, too.
Homer shook his head.
Maybe Jesus was the first zombie. That makes sense to me.
Goat almost asked him if he was serious or if this was some kind of twisted joke. He didn't, and therefore Homer did not have a reason to kill him. Chapter 86. What the Fink Thinks. WTLK Live Talk Radio, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We have Solomon from Philadelphia, said Gavin. Great to talk with you, Gavin. Love the show. Just love it. Always great to hear. So talk to me, Solomon. What do you think's going down in Stebbins? It's UFOs. This is exactly what happened at Roswell. How so, Solomon? First, they make an official statement, and then they recant it right away. Well, sure, but the first statement was about an outbreak of a new kind of virus, which they recanted. Viruses are terrestrial. Are they, Gavin? Well, you tell me. It's all part of the conspiracy. Something crashed in Stebbins, and that's how the virus was released. It was something in the blood of the aliens, something normal to their world, but not to ours. And the government is covering it up? Absolutely. They want to use that virus as a bioweapon. That's where these governments have always gotten their bioweapons. You think HIV came from people having sex with monkeys? Well, no, I don't, but there you go. HIV, bird flu, swine flu, Ebola. The reason they're so dangerous is because we have no natural immunity to that stuff. And why? Because it's not from here. How does that account for things like the Black Plague and the Spanish flu of the early 20th century? Solomon laughed. Come on, Gab. You of all people have to know that they've been visiting us since before they built the pyramids. Ah, and this whole cover-up, that fake news story by Billy Trout, the rumors of soldiers shooting people in Stebbins, that's just the military covering up the fact that they have a crashed UFO. It's textbook, Gavin. This is Roswell all over again. Chapter 87. The Situation Room, the White House, Washington, D.C. Mr. President, cried Sylvia Ruddy, I think we have something. Everyone in the Situation Room whipped around toward her and all conversation died. Tell me, said the president in a way that was an order flavored with a plea. Dr. Price at Zabriskie Point received the Lucifer 113 samples. I have him on video conference. She spoke into the phone. Dr. Price, I'm putting you on with the president. A moment later, Dr. Price's thin, ascetic face filled the big view screen. His eyes were red-rimmed with fatigue, but bright with excitement. Tell me something I want to hear, said the president. Do you have something for us? We believe so. My whole team has been tearing apart the 113 variation, and we've learned that Dr. Volker used new mutations of Toxoplasma gondii, which had always been a key component of Lucifer. Those mutations were part of his process of the neurological control functions of the bioweapon. While the genetically re-engineered green jewel wasp larvae drive the aggression of the infected, the Toxoplasma control the brain. That's part of the process of shutting down higher function while keeping active those nerves and processes responsible for walking, grabbing, biting, swallowing, and so on. Cut to it, Dr. Price, the president said tersely. Well, this is context, Mr. President. It explains what I think might work. Using the older form of Lucifer, we were experimenting with parasites that would essentially attack the modified parasites. We had a great deal of success with Neospora caninum, which is a parasite similar in form to Toxoplasma gondii, but one found predominantly in dogs. Under standard microscopic examination, the N. caninum sporozoite, which is the body of the parasite, closely resembles the T. gondii sporozoite, and both diseases share many of the same symptoms. However, and this is where we may have hit on it, the N. caninum infection has a much more severe impact on the neurological and muscular system of test subjects. How so? Asked Blair, and once more that dangerous spark of hope flared in his chest. The N. caninum variations we've been developing as a possible response to Lucifer create a certain set of symptoms, all of them in extreme degrees, that include stiffness of the pelvis and legs, paralysis distinguished by gradual muscle atrophy in which the muscles essentially seize up and can't move. A secondary set of symptoms include severe seizures, tremors, behavioral changes, weakness of the cervical muscles near to the neck, dysphagia, difficulty swallowing, and eventual paralysis of the muscles involved in respiration. Which means what, damn it? Snapped the president. It means, Mr. President, that we might be able to introduce a hostile parasite to the infected that will make them blind and paralyzed. Quite literally, it will stop them in their tracks. Good God, gasped Ruddy. You're talking about people. Dr. Price looked at her with heavily lidded eyes. No, ma'am, he said slowly. Once a person has been infected by Lucifer, by any version of Lucifer, they are no longer people. They are dead meat driven by a parasite. How is this a cure? Demanded General Burroughs. No, you don't understand, Price said. There is no cure. Maybe there will be one day, I don't know. That would take years of research. You asked me how to stop the infected. That's what this is, a weapon that can stop them. Blair watched the president's face, saw how this news hurt him. He didn't like the man, but right now he felt deeply sorry for him, and to a lesser degree for Price. What form would this weapon come in, Doctor? Asked Burroughs. If it's some kind of parasite, actually, said Price, the Chinese developed a Toxoplasma delivery system in the 90s. We've codenamed it Reaper. Lurid, I know, but it was designed to attack and destroy, so we acquired it from them, and, What's the potential effect of this Reaper on uninfected persons? Asked Blair. Price paused on that. We don't know. We've never tested this on people. How do we use it? Interrupted the president. Airbursts. The modified NK9 are held in stasis inside a dry medium that can be packed into rockets calibrated for low-level detonation over infected areas. How big is your quarantine zone?
The zone is a circle, 64 miles across, said Blair.
Price considered, quickly doing the math in his head. That's what, 12,861 square miles?
And it could expand, said Burroughs. How much of this K9 stuff do we need?
NK9, corrected Price. Or just Reaper. That's what we've been calling it too. Easier to say. Hold on, let me make that calculation. They watched him as he tapped for several excruciating moments on a laptop. Blair saw a frown carve itself deeply into Price's face. The required parasitic load would depend on population, terrain, and weather conditions. However, if we work with the prevailing winds, we could put enough of the parasite-rich medium in a standard airburst bomb or rocket to cover several square miles, less in a high airburst and low winds, more in the current conditions. Call it 50 tons of the medium?
That was ugly news. How fast can we get the Reaper material to Pennsylvania? Asked the president.
Price blinked like a bug. Mr. President, we don't have that much of the Reaper stockpiled.
How much do you have?
Between here and one other lab, maybe 8-9 kilos?
Shit, hissed Blair. Can you make more of it? Asked the president.
We can make a mountain of it, sir. Making it isn't difficult, but it will take time to set up a production process for it. And then there's manufacture time, bonding with the dry medium, payload assembly. Mr. President, at the very earliest, we could have the first batches ready for you in 6 days.
6 days. Those 2 words hung burning the air. Scott, asked the president in a leaden voice, do we have that kind of time? Without containment, sir?
Blair shook his head.
In 6 days, we'll have lost most of the East Coast and the entire South. In 6 days, Mr. President, 50 million people will be infected.
Dr. Price had nothing to say. There was no possible response to a statement like that. Chapter 88. Stebbins Little School, Stebbins, Pennsylvania. They went inside out of the rain. Sam Imura and his team, their weapons and gear returned to them, the cuffs removed, along with Des, Trout, Uriah Piper, Mrs. Madison, and a small handful of the more sober and steady adults. Des picked one of the smaller classrooms in order to limit the size of the crowd, and she closed the door. Several of the adults in the school clearly wanted to object, but none of them got farther than beginning to say something to her and then clearly thought better of it.
Where are the drives?
Asked Sam as soon as the door was closed. Trout started to answer, but Des cut him off. No, you first. You tell us what's happening.
We don't have time for that, Officer Fox, said Sam urgently.
We fucking make time for it. Sam turned appealing eyes to Trout, but he shook his head.
You heard the lady, said Trout. And if the clock is ticking, better cut right to it.
Sam glanced at his people, then gave a short sigh.
Okay, in the spirit of us actually getting somewhere, I'm going to shoot straight with you.
Figuratively speaking, murmured Trout.
Figuratively speaking. Let me preface it by saying that my boss is Scott Blair, the National Security Advisor. He was the one who advised the president to drop a fuel air bomb on Stebbins County.
Shit, said Des. What an asshole.
Sam shook his head. No, he's not. Put yourself in his place. He didn't invent Lucifer, and he wasn't part of any group that kept that plague after it should have been completely eradicated. Blair's only concern is just what his job title says. He advises the president on matters of national security. This plague threatens the entire nation. There was a window, a very small one, last night, when it might have been contained. That window closed when Mr. Trout here broadcast his appeal to the world to save the kids here in the school.
You're saying this is my fault? Demanded Trout.
No, sir. I'm not in the business of assigning blame. Neither, I might add, is Scott Blair. I'm a response to a threat. Blair is probably the clearest thinking person in Washington,
When Volker first defected and gave Lucifer to our government, a set of response protocols were written that appropriately addressed the level of threat. If you spoke with Dr. Volker, Mr. Trout, then you understand how incredibly dangerous this plague is. Look at what happened to your town because of a single person being infected. Homer Gibbon. The spread was immediate and exponential. However, it reached that moment when the window could have been closed on the spread. "By killing children?" demanded Mrs. Madison. Sam gave her a flat stare. "No. By killing everyone in this town. Every single living person. And ideally every animal, bird, and cockroach. Anything that could possibly carry the disease beyond these borders." "That's insane." "No," said Sam. Creating a doomsday weapon was insane. Using that weapon in an attempt to punish a death row prisoner was insane. That's where the guilt and blame are, ma'am. If Dr. Volker's handler, the CIA operative assigned to oversee his actions, had done his job, then we would not be having this conversation. If Dr. Volker had been properly assessed, he would have been put into a psychiatric facility and kept far away from any materials with which he could do harm. But, as I said, that was yesterday's news. The truth is that the disease was injected into Homer Gibbon, and now it's loose." Mrs. Madison and several of the others were shaking their heads. "Tell me," said Sam with dwindling patience, "if you were in charge of the military response to this outbreak, tell me how you would have handled it differently. What could anyone have done once this thing was known to be out? Not killed children, which is what Mr. Trout told the world we were doing, and the president pulled back. The bombs never fell, and the kids in this school are alive. Okay, that's a wonderful thing. No one wants to kill kids, not even the most extreme hawks. I've got a younger brother and a baby stepbrother. It would crush me if anything happened to them. If they were in Stebbins County, I know I would feel exactly the same way you do. It's impossible for a sane and moral person to feel anything other than outrage, shock, and horror." "If your brothers were in Stebbins, and it was on you to order the bombs," asked Trout, "what would you do?" "The soldier in me would order the drop," said Sam. "But me, Sammy Mora, I'd never want those bombs dropped. I'd hesitate and hope for another solution. That's what anyone would do. And that is what they call fatal hesitation. Emphasis on fatal. That human connection skews the logic, and in these situations, the logic cannot be skewed. That's why we have so many procedures in the military, and everything from basic training to missile launch sequences that are designed to separate the human element from the necessary action." "But the children," said Mrs. Madison, leaning on it, forcing awareness of the implications. Sam looked around at the faces. "This is the problem. You don't understand the implications of what you've done, of what you still think is the right thing. You want to save these children, and that's beautiful. That's so wonderfully human. But if we can't get ahead of Lucifer, then these children are going to die anyway. If not today, then when your food runs out. You'll have to leave the building, and all you'll find out there will be more dead. Dead adults and dead children. That's the only other way this works out. If we can't stop Lucifer, then everyone will die. Everyone. Everyone's children. Here in Pennsylvania and everywhere else. Listen to me. Hear that word. Everywhere. There is no way this disease can stop on its own. It will continue to spread exponentially. The most conservative estimates of a global pandemic of this disease is total human annihilation in 10 weeks, with the deaths of all 300 million Americans occurring during the first 5 to 10 days. He looked at Billy Trout. "Tell me, how many children are you willing to kill?" Chapter 89. The Northern Levees, Stebbins County. Burl and Vic lumbered toward Jake, and with every step the world tilted further and further off its axis. Nothing here made sense, not in any way. 3 teenaged girls walking in a storm like they couldn't even feel the weather, one of them naked. Then those same girls attacking Burl and the other guys, biting them, eating them. Jake's friends, big men, screaming and falling, dying. And and getting the fuck back up. It was all so wrong that for a broken handful of seconds, Jake forgot about everything else. He lay there in the mud and didn't think about the pain in his leg, the ache in his chest from coughing up mud, or the need to flee. He lay on his stomach, hands pushed into the mud to raise his chest and head, and watched things come forward that used to be his friends. No. He heard the word, but for a moment he could not tell who had spoken it. Jake never felt his lips move to form the word, didn't feel the push of air as it escaped his throat. No. The word hung in the air, telling him everything he needed to understand about the moment and about the future. It answered every question he had. No. The rain fell in great slanting lines, popping on every surface. No, Jake said, trying to explain it to the day, trying to be reasonable about all this. No. Burl and Vic opened their mouths. They had nothing to say, though. Instead, they shared with Jake the only thing they understood, the only thing that mattered now to each of them. They uttered a deep, resonating, aching moan of appalling hunger. It did not matter that the hunger was new. The sound of their moans made it clear even to Jake's tortured mind that this hunger ran as deep as all the need in the world, a strange and alien hunger that could never be satisfied. Behind the two men, the girls raised their heads. Then, to his deepening horror, Jake saw that Richie and Tommy, what was left of Richie and Tommy, were climbing to their feet. All those pale faces turned toward the sound of that dreadful moan and joined it. With broken jaws and shattered teeth, with torn throats and dead mouths, every one of them, all of them, raised their voices in a shared expression of that endless hunger. Jake de Groot clapped his hands to his ears to stop the noise, but he could hear it all the way down to the pit of his soul. He screamed. At the sound of his scream, Burl began moving faster. The sticky suction of the mud tried to slow him, but Burl's face became a mask of bestial hunger, and he tore his feet free step by step and reached with hooked fingers toward Jake. That's when something in Jake's mind snapped. The tethers anchoring him to the civilized man he was parted, and that part of him floated away, like a mask being removed to reveal his true face. It was an older, simpler, far less evolved face, and the eyes of the ultra-primitive saw the oncoming threat, and the synapses of the ancient lizard brain triggered unthinking and immediate reaction. Jake screamed again, but this time it came out more as a growl, as a snarl of denial and fear and determination. He pushed himself backward, his legs kicking at the mud for purchase, finding it, taking his weight, propelling him into a crouch on fingers and toes. He skittered backward like a dog, hissing at the pain instead of with it. Then he slewed around and launched himself away, rising into a sloppy run, falling, getting up again, running, and all the time screaming. Burl and Vic and the others followed like a pack of rabid dogs. Jake angled toward his front-end loader, putting it between himself and the pack. The keys were inside the cab. If he could only get to them. But Burl and Vic split, each one heading toward one end of the machine as if this was something they had rehearsed. On some level, Jake knew that they were simply taking the shortest route for each of them, but it felt like a coordinated attack. Jake glanced up at the cab and then to each side. He wasn't going to make it. If he got inside, would the reinforced safety glass keep them back? Even if the glass held, the door didn't lock from inside. He began backing away from the machine. The trailer they were using as a temporary office was 40 yards away. Jake spun around, deciding to make for it. If he could get inside, the doors had locks. There were desks he could push in front of the door to block it, The windows were tiny, too small for someone like Burl to climb in through. All of that flashed through his brain as he took the first step toward the trailer. Burl lunged for him, actually jumping like an animal to try and grab him. Then suddenly, Burl's head snapped to one side, and his leap turned into a twisted tumble that sent him splatting down to the mud, where he slid to a twisted stop. His face was gone. Simply gone. Jake stared at Burl, trying to understand this new mystery, this new insanity. Even his lizard brain didn't know how to process this. Then something pinged off the bucket of the front-end loader and went whizzing past his ear with a sound like an angry wasp. There was a second ping, a third. That's when he heard the sounds. Distant, small, hollow. Pock, pock, pock. He whirled and crouched, staring into the rain. Someone was firing. Cold hands suddenly grabbed him from behind, and Jake was falling. He twisted violently around to see Vic right there, tearing at him with torn fingernails, snapping at him with cracked teeth. Vic was tall, over 6 feet, and nearly 200 pounds. Jake towered over him, though, standing 6'8" and packing an extra 100 pounds of muscle and mass on his frame. With power born of fear and desperation, he swung a punch into Vic's face that knocked the man 5 feet back. Teeth and blood flew. Vic hit the side of the bucket, spun, fell to his knees, and then was abruptly flung sideways as a fusillade of bullets tore into him, punching holes in thigh and hip and ribs and skull. Vic dropped and lay utterly still. Jake wanted to stand and stare. He needed to take a moment to reset all of the dials in his head. However, bullets pinged and whanged off the machine, and behind him the other things were still coming. Jake cut them a single quick look and realized they were paying no heed to the bullets that pocked the mud around them, or to the bullets that tore into their own flesh. Jake saw clothes puff up as rounds struck them. He saw chunks of bloody skin go flying into the rain. It was insane. It was like they didn't care, or couldn't feel, or were... His mind teetered on the edge of saying what he thought it was or might be. Instead, he turned and dove for cover as more bullets hammered into the yellow skin of the caterpillar. The bucket was still low to the ground where he had paused it when everything started turning to shit. Beneath the bucket was a trench cut by the scoop, and Jake wriggled into that. Big as he was, the trench was deep enough for him to get below ground level, but it was already half filled with muddy water that was stingingly cold. Dozens of bullets hit the front-end loader and went ricocheting off into the storm. Jake could hear men shouting. Richie came splashing through the puddles, still moaning, still hungry. And then he was falling backward, bits of flesh and bone exploding from his chest, his throat, his face, his skull. Then one of the girls fell with a big hole in her lower back. As soon as she hit the ground, she began to crawl, as if the pain she had to be feeling didn't mean a goddamn thing to her. She saw Jake and began crawling toward his hiding place. She made it halfway there before a bullet struck her in the side of the head and blew brain matter 5 feet across the mud. Jake saw it all from his hole. The shouts were louder now, men calling to each other as they came running across the construction site. Men in white hazmat suits and combat boots, men with rifles and belts hung with grenades. Soldiers. Jake frowned, unable to understand this. Why were the soldiers in hazmat suits like on TV? That was the stuff they wear when there's some kind of toxic spill. Only this was a hurricane, not a spill, or whatever they call a storm this bad this far inland. Supercell, something like that. It wasn't any toxic spill, at least not as far as Jake knew. Unless... He blinked rainwater out of his eyes. Suddenly, a lot of things tumbled together into a single pattern, ugly but glued together by some kind of logic. What if there was a toxic spill? The radio had been crazy all day with weird shit. Something about a riot out at Doc Hartnup's funeral home. Something else happening at the school. Jake only caught bits and pieces of it because you can't really listen to the radio while operating heavy equipment. Too much noise. Now he wondered what he'd missed. And he wondered what kind of trouble he was in. He almost called out to the soldiers. Almost. It was not his lizard brain that made him hold his tongue. No, it was the civilized part of his brain. The part that believed that if things were this bad, if they were sending in soldiers in germ warfare gear and letting them kill people this randomly, then things were already in the shitter. Those soldiers never called out a warning. They never checked to see if Burl and the others needed help. They had simply opened fire. "Oh, God," he breathed. But he did it very, very quietly. As the soldiers hunted down the last girl and Jake's other friends, he sank down into the water until just his eyes and nose were out. He breathed as shallowly as he could, and he closed his eyes. In order to try and stay alive, he did his level best to pretend to be already dead. Chapter 90. Stebbins Little School, Stebbins, Pennsylvania. Des looked as if she wanted to either throw up or punch Sammy Morrow's teeth out. Either way, Trout wanted to grab the moment and pull it out of the fire. "Captain Imura," he said firmly, "I hear what you're saying, and as a newsman I appreciate the urgency of your story, but if this thing is already out, then why does it matter if I have a copy of Volker's research? Go find Volker. He has all of it. Hell, he's the science. Go waterboard him. I'm sure he'd be happy to tell you anything you want to know. Coming after me seems kind of a waste of—" Sam's eyes were cold. "Herman Volker is dead. He committed suicide." Trout bowed his head and slumped into a chair. "Christ. Why the fuck didn't you say so? You assholes always have to drag everything out. Shit." "We just found out about it," said Sam. "Until now, he's been MIA and you were the only known source of intel. Now do you understand why those drives are so important? They are the only known record of Volker's work. We have plenty of research on Lucifer, but no one has a clue about what Volker did when he modified the disease into Lucifer 113. Initial analysis of the infected indicate that the disease is radically different from the old Cold War version. We don't know if we have the time necessary to deconstruct and analyze Volker's version. Mr. Trout, where are the flash drives?" Trout's mouth felt as if it was filled with burned ashes and bile. In a strained whisper, he said, "I gave them to my cameraman." "Who is he and where can we find him?" "Gregory Weinman. Everyone calls him Goat. He's the one who was taking my stand-ups and streaming them to the net." "Where?" "He walked out of town just as the guard were setting up the roadblocks. The last time I spoke with him, before you idiots began jamming all calls, he was at the Starbucks in Bordentown." Sammy Morrow staggered. He took 2 or 3 small, aimless steps and almost collapsed against the blackboard on the wall. He put his face in his hands and said, "Jesus, save us all." "What is it?" snapped Des. "What's wrong?" Boxer went over and put his hand on Sam's shoulder. Moonshiner and Shortstop sat down hard on the chairs. Only Gypsy held her ground. "What's wrong?" demanded Des. "Wrong?" mused Gypsy. "What's wrong is that we are all totally and completely fucked. That's where the outbreak is," said Gypsy. "The Air Force dropped fuel air bombs on the whole area. Bordentown is nothing but a cloud of hot ash." Chapter 91. Suburbs of Pittsburgh.
"How we doing, boy?"
asked Homer Gibbon. Goat hoisted a fake smile onto his face. "We're getting some really great stuff here. I can't wait to get this onto the net." Homer pursed his lips. In the dark, Goat couldn't see the blood smeared all over the man. What little there was made it look as if the man was painted in tar. but he stank. At first the car had been filled with the sheared copper smell of fresh blood, but now it was turning sour as the cells thickened and died. It was like being inside a meat locker with the power off. It took great willpower and a fear of reprisal to keep from vomiting.
"You think they'll watch it?"
asked Homer, sounding a little insecure about it. A sharp laugh escaped Goat before he could stop it.
"You think that's funny, boy?"
asked Homer in a tone that was abruptly menacing. "No," Goat said quickly. "Far from it. I'm pretty sure everyone in the world is going to watch these videos. I don't think anyone is going to watch anything else." Homer looked at him for a long time.
"You really think so?"
"Yeah," said Goat with complete honesty. "I absolutely think so." Chapter 92. Stebbins Little School, Stebbins, Pennsylvania. "That is not a happy-looking man," said Billy Trout. He and Des stood together watching Captain Sammy Mora as he stood on the far end of the room, having a mostly one-sided phone conversation. The news that Goat had the drives and that the Starbucks, where he was waiting for Trout's call, had been destroyed, had hit everyone very hard. Imora stepped aside to call it into his boss, the National Security Advisor. Imora had looked pretty defeated at the start of that call, but as the seconds peeled off and fell away, the man's shoulders slumped. Then Imora straightened and cut a sharp, appraising look at Trout. "Uh-oh," said Des. "Yeah," agreed Trout. Imora came hurrying over, still holding the phone in the way people do when the line is still open. "Mr. Trout, do you still have the satellite phone Wyman gave you?" Trout nodded and produced it. "Is it charged?" "Half charged, but yeah." "He has it," Imora said into the phone, listened, and added, "Good. We'll try again in 5 minutes." He disconnected the call and considered Trout. "Listen, I guess it'll come as no surprise to you that they've been jamming all communications from Stebbins County." "Huh, you don't say," murmured Trout dryly. "I just asked my boss to have all jamming stopped. Satellite interference, cell lines, the works." "Good," said Des. "And then maybe we can go around and close all the barn doors, because I'm pretty sure the horses have all run off." Imora gave her a few millimeters of a tight smile. "If there's even the slightest chance that Wyman left the vicinity of the Bordentown Starbucks, then maybe we can reestablish contact." "His name's Goat," said Trout, "and he didn't have a car. He walked across a field to get to the Starbucks, or maybe hitchhiked. And there's at least a small chance he hitchhiked again. If he's as tech-savvy as you said, then maybe he realized that service was being jammed and he moved on to someplace outside of the interference zone." "Which he wouldn't have had to do if you ass clowns didn't jam him in the first place," snapped Des. "If he and Billy had been able to stay in touch, you'd already have Volker's notes." Imora turned to her. "Really, Officer Fox, you want a Monday morning quarterback this now? Is that the best use of our time?" "I'm just saying." "Fine. We fucked up. It's hereby noted." Des looked mildly embarrassed, an attitude that Trout found amusing. As he enjoyed having his scrotum remain attached, he declined to say so. Imora looked at his watch. "The jamming should be down in a couple of minutes. Let's keep our fingers crossed." Trout glanced from him to the other members of his team. "Who exactly are you guys? You said private contractors? That's the PC phrase for mercenaries, isn't it?" In a manner of speaking. "We're former U.S. military who do special jobs." "Like what?" "Like classified stuff that I'm not going to talk about to a reporter." Des sniffed. "I met some of your kind in Stan." Imora smiled. "The contractors in Afghanistan and Iraq were mostly Blackwater, who are, even by the somewhat loose standards of the mercenary community, total dickheads. Not as bad as Blue Diamond, but swimming at the edges of the same cesspool. Personally, I wouldn't piss on any of them if they were on fire." "Don't sugarcoat it, Captain," said Trout. "There are all kinds of contractors, just like there are all kinds of reporters and all kinds of cops." "And what kind are you?" asked Des sharply. "The kind I can live with," he said. He cocked his head to one side. You know, Mr. Trout, I was given a pretty free hand for how I wanted to handle this. We could have done a hard infill of the school and taken you. You could have tried, growled Des. But Imura shook his head. I mean no disrespect when I say this, officer, but if we wanted to play it that way, we would have succeeded. I've met plenty of spec ops jocks, and you've never met operators like us. I'm not saying this to blow my own horn, but to give you a perspective check. You have every right to think of anyone in a military uniform as your enemy. I don't blame you. However, if we were your enemies, you would be dead, Officer Fox, and Mr. Trout would be having an even worse day than he's already had. It was my choice on how to play this, and I set you up to take a run at us outside so we could take you. From all accounts, you are a formidable law officer, but we play a different kind of ball. Let's be clear on that. Okay, said Trout, before Des could get into gear with the kind of verbal counterattack that would probably end in fisticuffs. You could have done it the Rambo way, and instead you didn't. Why waste time making that point? Because, said Imura, if we can accept that killing you isn't high on my list of priorities, then maybe we can all put our dicks away and start working together. Trout smiled thinly. It's a lovely speech, Captain, but if knowing Des has taught me anything, it's that trust is earned. Not killing you doesn't earn trust. It's a good start, said Trout. Let's see where it takes us. He lifted the satellite phone and punched Goat's number. The number rang. And rang. And kept on ringing until Trout felt his heart begin to sink. Then someone answered it. Billy! Cried Goat. Oh my God, Billy! There was a snarl of a harsh voice, the sound of an open palm on flesh, a cry of pain, and then a different voice growled, Who the fuck's this? It took Trout a couple of stumbling moments to match this new voice to a recent memory and then to fit those awkward pieces into a puzzle shape that made only fractured sense. He felt his heart lurch in his chest. He said, Homer? Chapter 93. The Situation Room, the White House, Washington, D.C. Scott Blair closed his cell and wanted to scream. Instead, he made another call and got the director of the National Security Agency on the line. He explained about Goat Weinman having the flash drives. What do you want me to do? Asked the director. Hack his phone and email. He's a reporter and he's on the run. There's every chance that he sent the data to himself as a way of keeping it safe. Find out. The director didn't ask whether Blair had a warrant. That time had already passed. Chapter 94. Suburbs of Pittsburgh.
Why, as I live and breathe, this Mr. Live from the Apocalypse his own self, said Homer. Billy Trout, how do you do?
Homer grinned into the phone as he spoke. Beside him, Goat cowered back, one hand pressed to the welt on his cheek where the killer had belted him when Goat answered the call. Homer? Repeated Billy Trout. Is this really Homer Gibbon?
In the flesh. Can't tell you how much I enjoyed your little speeches on the radio a couple of hours ago. Really exciting stuff.
How?
You gonna finish that sentence?
How are you with Goat? Is he okay? Did you hurt him? Christ, you better not have touched him, you sick fuck.
Hey, mind your manners, warned Homer, or I will do some particular damage to your friend.
No, don't.
I ain't done shit to him so far, but that could change right quick. So make sure you keep a civil tongue in your head.
Yes, okay, I'm sorry. I'm just concerned for my friend. May I speak with him, please? Homer pulled onto the shoulder, put his hand over the mouthpiece, and turned to Goat.
This thing have a speaker?
Yes, said Goat, and when Homer held out the device, he flicked the switch. Homer leaned close and very quietly said,
You don't speak unless I give the nod.
Yes, no problem,
And if you say the wrong thing, you know what I'll do to make you sorry about it."
"Yes."
"Good."
Homer held the sat phone up between them.
"We got this on speakers so Mr. Goat can hear you too."
"Thank you," said Trout. "Goat, you okay there, buddy?" Goat looked for approval and got a nod. "I'm okay, Billy. He hasn't hurt me. Thank God. Can you tell me where you are?" Homer shook his head. "No," said Goat. "I can't do that. Can you tell me what you're doing?" Homer thought about it, then nodded. "Mr. Gibbon wants me to tell his side of the story, the whole story, about the black eye and the red mouth. You remember those from the trial, Billy?" "Sure. That was only part of the story. A small part." Goat saw Homer give him a small nod of approval and decided to take that script and run with it. "There's so much more to the story, Billy. I know you'd really appreciate it. It's the greatest story anyone's ever told. It's so deep, so big." Homer looked pleased, but Goat was afraid of overdoing it, so he closed with that. "I see," said Trout. "Sounds like something I definitely want to hear." "Oh, you really do." An idea occurred to Goat, and he hoped Trout would be sharp enough to catch the ball and run with it. "It's like you always told me, Billy. There are layers and layers to Homer Gibbon. No one really knows him. The stuff at the trial was all bullshit. No one ever asked him the right questions. No one ever really wanted to know what he saw and why he does what he does. It's like people didn't think the red mouth or the black eye were real. You always said there was more to the story. You always said that it was a crime that no one ever let Mr. Gibbon speak to the jury, speak from his heart, and tell the whole truth. You were right, Billy. Absolutely right." There was only a half beat before Trout said, "Nice to know you were paying attention, Goat, and I'm jealous that you're there to get that story. Will we ever get to hear it?" Goat waited for Homer to give another nod. "That's what we have planned. I have some incredible stuff already. Really amazing stuff. As soon as we get somewhere with Wi-Fi, I'm going to upload it and blow everyone's minds." "That's great. I'm so jealous, man. You're going to do more than blow minds, Goat. You're going to open minds. I know. Goat, make sure you preserve everything. That information is too valuable to lose. You should back it up. I have it saved to my hard drive. No, back it up on those flash drives," said Trout, very clearly and precisely. "That's how the best reporters preserve the most important information." Goat almost asked him what the hell he was talking about when he realized that Billy was spinning the game on him, telling him something. And he got it. The flash drives. Important information. "You're absolutely right, Billy. I'll make sure I protect that information." "Good," said Trout, and the relief was there to be heard in his voice. "Mr. Gibbon."
"Call me Homer,"
said the killer. "Thank you. That's an honor, sir. Please call me Billy. I want to thank you for what you're doing for Goat. This is the kind of story he's always wanted. Something big, something that will do a lot of good."
"That's what this is, sure enough."
"Is there any way I can be of assistance?"
Homer snorted. "Aren't you stuck in that little school with a bunch of kids?"
"I might be able to get out of here. I'd be happy to help Goat with this story. With his camera work and me doing the interviews, we can—"
"No thanks," said Homer. "We got this covered. You have a good day now."
He ended the call and pulled back onto the road, heading northwest. Goat's heart was hammering with painful insistence, and he stared longingly at the satellite phone. His mind, however, was replaying Billy's words. Preserve the most important information. He cleared his throat and made his voice sound normal. "Billy's right," he said. "I need to back everything up on flash drives."
"What are they?"
asked Homer. Goat explained, then added, "I always carry some extras. It's a reporter thing." He dug into his pocket and showed Volker's drives to Homer.
"All the videos you've been taking fit onto those little things?"
"Absolutely. And then we need to get it out to the world."
"Wi-Fi, right?"
"Wi-Fi," agreed Goat.
"Okie dokie,"
said the killer. He stepped on the gas, and the Escalade plowed through the storm winds, heading toward Pittsburgh. heading toward hope. Chapter 95. Mobile Command Post, Fayette County. Major General Zetter and his top aides met in the mobile command post parked 3 miles from the blast zone. The big vehicle rocked as winds buffeted it. Electronic workstations provided real-time intel from satellites and field observation posts, and one wall of the MCP was covered in a high-res satellite map of Stebbins and Fayette counties. "Sir," said one of his captains, "we're clocking sustained winds of 40 miles per hour with gusts up to 70. Western Fayette has winds above 50. We can't keep the birds in the air." This had been a problem since the start of this campaign. Helicopters do not like high winds, and with storm gusts, high tension wires, unlighted structures such as grain silos, cellular towers, and trees swaying in the wind, the helos had had a difficult night. 5 were down with damage, 2 were wrecked, with the loss of 1 complete crew and 2 other guardsmen in the hospital. Zetter coughed and fished in his pocket for a handkerchief, found one and covered his mouth as the coughs continued. It was the ash from the firebombs. He needed some clean air and maybe a gallon of mouthwash. "Sir?" his aide prompted gently. "Should I recall the birds?" On the big satellite map, there were hundreds of small red dots. People fleeing from the attack on Route 653 and the resulting bombs.
"Keep them flying,"
he said. Another fit of coughing racked him, shorter but intense. "Sir, did you say—"
"I said keep them flying,"
snapped Zetter, his face bright red from coughing. The aide nodded and turned away to relay the order. As Zetter dabbed at his mouth, aware of the eyes that were on him, he listened to a couple of other officers coughing. They'd all been out there with him. It made him remember the respiratory problems from people who had inhaled the smoke after the collapse of the towers. Some of those people got sick from what they had sucked into their lungs. Some died. He fished for the condition caused by breathing in particulate matter. Pneumonitis? He thought that was it. Zetter wondered if he was going to get sick from the smoke. He already had some mild emphysema from all those years he smoked. He didn't smoke anymore, but it was damage done. No cancer, though, so he'd been lucky there, but his wind was for shit. A long flight of stairs could put him on his ass for 10 minutes. Now this. The dust, the stress, the fear. Another aide, who was hunched over a small desk, speaking into a phone, raised his head and pointed to the western edge of the map. On it, several larger dots were moving in opposition to the outer wave of fleeing people. "General, the additional units have reached the outbreak zone. I have their commanding officer on the line." Zetter hauled himself out of the chair and lumbered over to the desk, snatched the phone and identified himself.
"With whom am I speaking?"
"Sir," said a woman's voice, "this is Colonel Ruiz."
"Give me a sit rep, Colonel."
"We are tracking a large number of individuals heading west through farmlands. Estimate 400 plus. They appear to be civilians."
"Colonel, have you been briefed on Lucifer?"
"I have, sir."
"Are you able to determine if these people are infected?"
"No, sir. Though a large number of them appear to be injured. We are seeing torn clothing, what appear to be flash burns, and—"
"Colonel, can you contain the civilians and examine them for bites? We need to make certain that—"
Before the colonel could answer, Zetter could hear sounds from her end of the line. Military personnel yelling to the oncoming wave of people. Zetter turned and looked at the satellite map and saw the outer edge of the wave of lights, closing very fast on the line of larger dots, military vehicles and their crews. He heard the shouts turn to yells. And then there was the rattle of gunfire. A few sporadic shots at first, then sustained gunfire. And screams. Colonel Ruiz never came back on the line. Chapter 96. Laurel Ridge State Park, Fayette County. Demolitions specialist Mike Crucial liked blowing things up. After getting caught once rigging cherry bombs to the tailpipe of his high school disciplinarian, Mike was given the first of what became a series of lectures. Half the lecture focused on not playing with dangerous items and the dangers to himself and others. Once during that half of the lecture, Mike had made the mistake of saying, "Yeah, blah, blah, blah," out loud. He spent the next month in detention and got his ass hammered flat at home. That was 9th grade. The second half of the lecture took a different direction. It was filled with suggestions for how he could turn his hobby into something useful. The military. Nobody loves blowing things up more than the Army. That was the gist. Not in those words, of course, but that's the message Mike took away with him. Occasionally there was a third part of the lecture, more of a warning, really. The only really likely alternative for someone like him was a different institution, one with bars. After high school, and with no adult criminal record at all and his juvie offenses sealed, he wrote an administrative recommendation from the school vice principal into the National Guard. During screenings and training, it became clear to everyone that Mike Cruciel liked to blow things up. And when it became clear that he wasn't going to be a danger to his fellow Americans, they put him into the right classes and taught him everything he ever wanted to know about explosives, IEDs, mines, grenades, satchel charges, and all of those other wonderful toys. He discovered that his connection to explosives went beyond the simple pleasure of seeing things go bang. He had a real talent for it. And working in the field, being allowed to play with explosives, gradually erased the immature thrill-seeker part of him in favor of a more focused and intellectual aspect. Bombs of various kinds became like puzzles, selecting the right device for each situation, purpose, or goal. He had earned another stripe in Afghanistan, and there was already some talk about him going higher. There was talk about OCS and maybe a career in the Army, rather than a short hitch to keep out of jail. In the world of military ordnance, Mike Cruciel had found himself. He never expected to be planting mines here on American soil. Not outside of a test range, but the orders from General Zetter had been crystal clear. The infected were breaking through the lines. There were several choke points where the landscape and the presence of rivers and streams would funnel anyone on foot to routes of least resistance. He and his partner Cyrus were assigned to mine one of those routes. 2 miles farther down the road, a checkpoint was being reinforced in case any infected got through. Mike smiled at that thought. Get through? Not once he was done. No, sir. The orders were to disable any infected. Killing them, Mike was told, was more difficult in that it required very specific damage to the brain and brain stem. Fair enough. He could rig the paths so that anything dumb or unlucky enough to step onto that path would be crippled in a hot second. That would allow Mike and his partner to finish them off with headshots, or they could be left for the roving patrols that were scheduled to check all of these hot spots. He studied geodetic survey maps and then walked the landscape to make his own determinations about likely routes. The infected were supposed to be as close to brain dead as made no difference. Aggressive, but stupid. That's how one of the guys described them. Mike had to make some important decisions, and he took a little extra time to do it, fighting the clock to get it all right. Mike concentrated on blast mines that would be triggered by someone stepping on them. He set the tension so that anyone over 60 pounds would trigger it. A deer's footstep wasn't heavy enough because its weight was distributed between 4 legs. But a human? When a person stepped on a blast mine, the device's charge detonated, creating a blast shock wave composed of very hot gases traveling at extremely high velocity. When the blast wave breaks the ground surface, it results in a massive compression force that blows a victim's foot off. Infected or not, they were going down. In areas where a larger group might pass, Mike planted the bigger and heavier fragmentation mines. These were crammed with several kilograms of shrapnel. A real party pleaser. And for narrow areas where a single infected might pursue one of the patrolling officers, Mike positioned more than a dozen M86 pursuit deterrent munitions. These PDMs were small U.S. anti-personnel mines generally used by special forces to deter pursuit. In function, they were like small hand grenades, and each had a pin and a fly-off lever. Once the pin is pulled and the lever has been ejected, a timer starts, and after 25 seconds, it launches 7 tripwires with a maximum range of 6 meters. That creates a spiderweb effect. Anyone pursuing the user trips a wire that activates the mine, and a liquid propellant charge launches the mine a couple of meters into the air. The fragmentation warhead detonates, breaking the mine into 600 flesh-rending fragments. Normally, these devices deactivated themselves after a few hours, but Mike disabled the timers. To warn other soldiers, however, he tied plastic tags to tree branches. Yellow for landmines, orange for devices mounted in the trees. The tags had tiny sensors that would alert troops to their presence. Modern warfare, baby. Mike loved it. Elsewhere, in spots where the infected were closing in on fields, Mike heard that planes were going to be dropping cluster bombs, part of the Gator landmine system. The Navy would drop 500-pound CBU-78Bs, and the Air Force would lay down some 1,000-pound CBU-89Bs. Very heavy shit. Mike wished he could be there to see it. Not the drop. He wanted to see what happened when a bunch of infected tried waltzing across a field of those puppies. Kaboom! Once Mike had everything just so, he carefully retreated to where his partner waited. The guy they paired him with was a moon-faced kid from Monroeville named Cyrus, who never said 2 words when no words would do. Mike knew chattier rocks, but that was okay. It was better when Cyrus said nothing, because when he did say something, it was dumb shit like, "Look, a deer." Like it was a thing of wonder. A deer. In the woods. How amazing. This was the ass end of Pennsylvania, deep in farm country, and both Stebbins and Fayette counties overlapped with state forests. Deer were as thick as mosquitoes out here, and just as annoying. Big brown rats, in Mike's view. In the dark, though, and with all this rain, deer were a real problem. You could hear them and not know what was moving in the woods. You could see them and not know what they were because they blended in so well and moved so quietly. And they could just as easily trip a mine as one of the infected. Mike explained this to Cyrus, who didn't so much nod or say he understood as simply look marginally less vacant for a moment. "We need an elevated shooting position," suggested Mike. "That way if we see any deer coming along the path, we can put them down, keeping the network of devices intact. Okay?" Cyrus made a grunting sound that Mike took as assent. He put Cyrus in the crotch of an elm. For all his apparent vacuity, the kid could climb like a monkey. He was also a good shot, a safe weapons handler. He wasn't rewarding company, but Mike didn't expect to take any friendly fire. With Cyrus in place, Mike drifted down a game trail, stepping around or over tripwires, double-checking that everything was just so. Then he froze. It wasn't exactly that Mike heard or saw anything, but instead had a sense that something moved out there in the storm-filled, shadowy woods. He turned very slowly, surveying the landscape. The boughs of the trees swayed like the arms of drunks fighting for balance. Rain fell between the trees, gathered into fat dollops, and dropped from branches and leaves. Winds howled through the forest at ground level, slapping the bushes and shrubs this way and that. There was so much movement that Mike couldn't tell if there was nothing out there or an entire herd of deer. Command had warned of packs of infected crossing farm fields after the bombs in Bordentown, but so far Mike hadn't seen a single one of them. He heard the chatter on the radio and knew that there were some real problems out there, but it all seemed to be happening elsewhere. Sure as hell not here. So far, the most they'd seen was a red fox, a bunch of squirrels, and not much of anything else. The forest kept moving, but as far as Mike could tell, it was just Superstorm Zelda being a total bitch. He found his own tree and climbed up onto the lowest limb, relieved to have the dense canopy of leaves shield him from the heaviest of the rain. And then he saw something that was neither wind nor squirrel. The leaves trembled on the far side of a slope, and Mike put his rifle to his shoulder and aimed at the center of a wall of rustling shrubs. If it was a deer, he was going to shoot its Bambi ass before it could trip one of the mines. Then the shrubs parted and something stepped through. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't a fleeing civilian. It was a soldier. It was a soldier, in fact, that Mike knew. It was a good friend of his. Teddy? Sergeant Teddy Polk staggered out of the dense line of shrubs and nearly lost his footing at the top of the rise. His white hazmat suit was covered in mud and torn in several places, the hood hanging down behind his back. Polk had no rifle, and he walked uncertainly, weakly, with one hand clamped to his left bicep. Polk's foot came down wrong, and he pitched forward, staggering down the slope toward the pressure mine hidden halfway down. "Teddy, no!" bellowed Mike, as he dropped from the tree and began to run toward his friend. He knew the pattern of his traps. Teddy was walking right toward a blast mine. "Stop!" screamed Mike. "For God's sake, Teddy, freeze! Don't move! Landmines!" Teddy stopped. He looked around, but his face was clouded by pain and confusion. He blinked, and his mouth worked for a moment, trying to form a word. "Mike?" "Yeah, it's me. Shit, man, don't move. There's a mine 5 feet in front of you. Stay right there. Let me come to you." Teddy Polk nodded, but it was a vague movement, and Mike couldn't be sure if his friend really heard him. "Stay right there, okay, buddy? Don't move." Teddy swayed like a drunken man, but he didn't take another step. Mike began creeping through the deadly landscape he had created. He knew where he had planted everything, and the yellow and orange tags were there, the colors glowing with luminescent paint even in the darkness, and pulsing when the lightning flashed. Mike was almost to the safe zone when he heard a sound behind him, and he pivoted, expecting to see that idiot Cyrus. It wasn't. A woman stood directly behind him. Middle-aged, dressed in jeans and a sweater covered in flower appliques and blood. A woman with ragged bite marks on her cheeks and eyebrows. Black blood dribbled from between her lips. "Shit!" cried Mike, as he reached for his sidearm. The woman spit right into his face, into his eyes and mouth, a big, wet gob of black blood. Mike screamed and backpedaled, dropping the gun that was halfway out of its holster. The black muck was as thick as molasses, and it tasted like copper and bile. He gagged, but he could feel it in his mouth, itching, burning. He pawed it out of his eyes as he reeled. He could see, but only a smeared swatch of the world. The woman hissed and reached for him, but Mike backhanded her away. Then Teddy Polk caught him, kept him from falling. Teddy called his name, except that wasn't what Teddy said. It wasn't his name. It was just a meaningless moan. Not his name, not even a word. A moan, like the sound the woman made. Mike screamed. He tore free from Teddy Polk and shoved his friend, or whatever this thing now was, and watched the wounded soldier stumble backward. 2 steps, 3, and Teddy's foot came down on a pressure mine. Mike tried to run. He really tried. He pivoted in the mud, spun the woman behind him, trying to put her between his body and the blast, and Mike bolted for the steep upslope that was free of mines. He got 4 good steps away from Teddy before the blast. The shockwave picked him up and punched him hard into the slope. He felt something hit him in the lower back. He felt it stab him. Stab all the way through him. He half lay, half stood against the sharp canted slope, his chin resting on the knurled curve of an exposed tree root, his arms dangling at his sides. Thunder echoed in his ears, and he could feel warmth running in lines down the insides of his clothes, front and back. It was the only warmth he could feel. Everything else was strangely cold. Off somewhere to the north, he could hear someone call his name. Was it Cyrus? Was it his mother? He couldn't tell. His eardrums were ruptured, and his head hurt so badly he couldn't think. He didn't even remember pushing off from the slope. It happened somehow, and now he stood on the path, looking down at the red things that had been Teddy and the woman with the sweater. They had been right there when the mine exploded, and it had exploded them, torn them from humanity into, what, parts, pieces? Mike didn't like putting the right word to it. Teddy had no legs at all. He couldn't even see the pieces of them. His back hurt, and his stomach. He touched the front of his hazmat suit and tried to understand what he was touching. His eyes stung from the black blood the woman had spat at him. The itching in his mouth and throat was really bad. But Mike wasn't sure if he cared about that or if he was just aware of it. He ran his fingers over his stomach and over the thing that stood straight out from the white material of the hazmat suit. When he raised his fingers, he saw that they were smeared with red. Yeah, he thought. That's right. He knew on some detached level that he was hurt. Maybe hurt bad. He heard his name again. It floated to him on the wind. Definitely not his mother. Mike took a few small steps away from the red carnage on the ground. The rain jabbed at the skin of his face. It washed more of the black goo from his eyes. After a while, Mike looked down at his stomach, just to see. It took him a long time to understand what he was seeing, to construct an explanation for the long, slender, white thing that seemed to be growing out of him. It was jagged and heavy, like polished ivory. Except that it wasn't ivory. He knew what it was. He knew where it had come from. The woman's legs had been totally blown away, but not all of the parts were lost. Mike tried a word, one he thought made sense of this. Femur, he said. He heard how rational his voice sounded. That was okay. The itching in his mouth was now deeper. Inside his nose, behind his sinuses, down in his stomach, his lungs. Itching, hurting, aching. Mike felt something moving on his lips. Drops of blood. He touched them, looked at them. Red. Sure. But threaded through the red were lines of black, and inside the black were twisting little white things. He said the only word that really mattered, the word that made a statement about this whole farce, from the time his unit was rolled out until now. And maybe it was a statement about how this thing would continue to unfold. He said, "Fuck." He heard Cyrus call his name, and hearing the voice provoked two immediate and intense reactions in him. The first was that he wanted Cyrus to find him, to get him the hell out of here, to get him to an aid station because, fuck it, he had a piece of thigh bone shoved all the way through his body. Shit. The other reaction was totally different, totally alien, totally terrifying. When he heard his partner's voice, it made him so goddamn hungry. Hungry. Oh, God, he thought. He could hear Cyrus coming, crashing through the wet brush, circling wide around the area marked by the yellow and orange tags, coming close, coming fast, coming soon. Mike Cruciel tried to yell, to warn his partner, to tell him to get the fuck out of here. But his voice was barely his anymore. It was thick, filled with wrongness, and his warning cry sounded more like the moan of someone in pain. But not physical pain, not thigh bone through the stomach pain. No, it was a different kind of pain. The pain of a terrible, bottomless hunger. Cyrus would be here in a few seconds. He'd come running up to help. And then what? The officers had been pretty damn graphic in the briefings. They pulled no punches when they explained what happened to the infected. People who were like him. Jesus. As Cyrus came running, calling Mike's name, Mike turned and used the last little bit left that was his to own. He made his legs move. It was just a few steps. He heard Cyrus yell, "No!" Then Mike stepped onto one of the mines. He loved explosions. Always had. They made him feel powerful. They always comforted him. "Take me home," he thought, as he raised his foot, releasing the trigger. He rode the blast all the way out of the world. Chapter 97, Route 26, Southwestern Pennsylvania. "Put something on it!" screamed the man. "I'm trying!" His wife yelled back. In the back seat, the baby was crying. The woman knelt on her seat and tried to cram a folded baby blanket against the hole in her husband's shoulder. It was not a torrent. There was no artery there. But it pulsed with his heartbeat, and his heart was hammering. His whole right side was slick with red. "I don't have anything to tie it with," she said, trying to hold it in place with one hand as she tried to unbuckle her belt with the other. "How bad is it?" he demanded in a terrified voice. "It's not bad. It's not bad," she said, knowing it was a lie. "Did you see that? That cop just fucking bit me." I know. He must have been..." She let that go because she didn't know what the cop could have been. The radio was saying wild things, and the whole world behind them seemed to be on fire. "We need to find a hospital." "No," he barked. "No way. Keep the pressure on. I'll be okay." "But you're bleeding." "No way I'm stopping anywhere near here. Everyone's nuts around here." She worked the belt off and managed to cinch it around his arm. "Not too tight," he cautioned, feeling a little calmer, a little more in control as the miles fell away behind them. The baby was crying so loud that they both had to shout. "I'm okay," he said. "I'm good. See you to Lucy. I'll be fine." "We need to stop." But he shook his head. "No way. No damn way." The car shot down the road and vanished into the storm. They crossed the state line into West Virginia at nearly 80 miles an hour. Chapter 98, Beyond the Quarantine Zone, the Hearts and Armor Medieval Fair, Normalville, Pennsylvania. Rob Meyer and his friends sat around a small fold-out table in the single-wide trailer used as a green room for the performers on the fairground. None of them were in armor, having shucked the heavy chain and plate mail hours ago, after the pig roast that ended each day of swordplay, bawdy songs, medieval crafts, heavy drinking, and choreographed jousting. Since most of the events were under tents, the show had gone on yesterday, although in abbreviated form. The guys were all in sweats and t-shirts, their hair and beards glistening from rainwater. Rob had gone around the camp, banging on trailer doors, rousing the staff, telling them what was going on. Some of them already knew. Night owls who had been glued to their portable TVs or laptops since last night, watching storm-soaked reporters do stand-ups outside of the Stebbins County line. Others had slept through it, dropping off to exhausted sleep after shucking their weapons and armor. Now everyone was watching. Some there in the green room, others in their own trailers. No one was sleeping anymore. Not on the fairgrounds, and probably not anywhere. "Is this shit real?" asked one of the roustabouts. It was the 6th or 7th time he had asked the same question.
"It's real,"
said Rob. "Yeah, okay, but what is it?"
"It's a riot,"
said one of the grooms.
"I don't think so,"
said Rob. Before the groom could ask him to explain, the CBS affiliate out of Pittsburgh cut in with breaking news. They managed to get one of their news trucks close to a section of Route 653 in Fayette County. The reporter stood in the rain and shouted impossible things. Behind the reporter, something was burning. Police vehicles whipped red and blue lights through the night. "This is a scene of total chaos," said the reporter. "You can see the fires that are still burning. Witnesses claim that military aircraft dropped bombs on the western edge of Bordentown. We can't get any closer than 2 miles, but even from here, the heat is incredible. An unnamed source in Washington says that these measures are being taken to prevent an outbreak of an as-yet unknown disease. This source claims that the disease is highly contagious and causes anyone who becomes infected to act in a violent and irrational way. Local police departments throughout the region, including many in northwestern Maryland, are reporting a shocking increase in violent crimes." Behind the reporter, a man and woman, both bleeding from several wounds, were shoving their children into their car. The children were screaming, and the woman clutched a small, limp child to her breast. The husband slammed the doors and hit the gas so hard the rear tires showered a dozen people with mud. A moment later, there was a heavy crunch, and then the reporter was running, with the cameraman following. On the road, a woman in a waitress uniform lay sprawled in the road as the taillights of the car dwindled in the rain. "Are you seeing this?" cried the reporter. "That car just ran over a woman!"
"Is this shit real?"
asked the roustabout again.
"It's real,"
said Rob. "This is crazy," said one of the jousters. "That's close. That's like 15 miles from here."
"I know,"
Rob said, and cast a troubled eye toward the door. The groom said, "It doesn't make any sense. What kind of virus makes people do this kind of thing?"
"Maybe it's a—"
But that was as far as Rob got. There was a series of loud pops, and they all whirled toward the door.
"What the hell?"
There was another wave of them, sharper now, closer. "Someone's shooting!" But it was more than that. Beneath and between the shots, wrapped inside the fist of the storm, there were screams. Suddenly the whole bunch of them were scrambling up from the table and crowding through the door into the rainy darkness. The shots were louder but sporadic. A handgun, thought Rob, not a rifle, not automatic gunfire. They peered through the rain, trying to orient themselves. "There!" cried the groom, pointing down the long, wide avenue of the jousting field. The colored banners whipped and popped in the gusting wind. The field was turning into a muddy lake. On the far side of the field, the horses neighed and whinnied with anxiety. Rob took a few tentative steps onto the field, and for a few seconds he couldn't see anything. Then there were 3 more shots. 3 muzzle flashes that created a brief strobe effect that revealed struggling, staggering figures. The screams came from there, and Rob's mouth opened in horror as he saw staff members from the fair fighting with dozens of people. Strangers. Someone was firing, but there was only one last hollow crack, and the gun fell silent. The screams increased. Some of the men, the groom, the roustabout, and a few others, immediately began running toward the melee. They all had friends there. But Rob caught the arm of the jouster. "No," he said urgently. "There's too many. Christ, we have to do something." "I know. Come on." Rob dragged him toward the prop shed, which was bolted to the side of the green room trailer. Rob fished the key from his pocket, jammed it into the padlock, threw the lock and chain into the mud, and yanked the doors open. With only a quick, worried glance at the jouster, Rob began pulling items from the shed. He pressed a broadsword into the jouster's hands and then, almost as an afterthought, pulled a Rondash shield from the rack and handed it to him. "The fuck, man?" growled the jouster, holding up the sword. "It's not even sharp." "Yeah, but it's fucking heavy." He grabbed his own long sword, an exquisite replica of the 9th century Viking Seba sword, and another of the round shields. Then he and the jouster turned and began running. Some of the strangers were sprinting or staggering across the field toward them. They howled like animals. Their bodies were pale and wrong, and some of them had terrible wounds on their faces and arms and throats. "Jesus Christ!" cried the jouster, as two of them closed on him, racing forward with waxy white fingers. The jouster was frozen in shock and indecision, so Rob shouldered him out of the way. He smashed one of the strangers in the face with the shield and struck the other one across the face with the flat of his sword. The blows were heavy, backed by a lot of muscle and mass, powered by fear and a surge of adrenaline. The strangers staggered, slipped in the mud, and fell. And then they got back up again. Rob blinked in confusion. The strangers snarled, revealing teeth that were smeared with blood so dark it was almost black. Then they launched themselves at him. Once more Rob swung the rondash at one of the strangers. The shield was made of leather-covered wood with plates of metal studded with nails. Although the swords were unsharpened, the shields had to be fully functional or the performers would be crippled if they failed to block. Rob drove the metal edge of the rondash into the biting mouth of the closest attacker, and suddenly black blood and pieces of teeth filled the air. The man went down, but he writhed in the mud, trying to get back to his feet. Rob pivoted and brought his sword around in an overhand cut that packed muscle and gravity into the blow. Even without a sharpened edge, the second man's head burst apart, showering Rob and the jouster with brain matter and more of the black blood. They reeled back, spitting out the blood, gagging at the horror of what had just happened. Then they heard feet slopping in the mud, and they turned to see a dozen of the strangers running toward them. Rob and the jouster exchanged a brief look. For years they had played the roles of warriors, swordsmen and knights, Viking raiders, Roman soldiers, even pirates. They'd each fought in thousands of duels, and on their off days, they fenced with their peers. They were superb swordsmen, and each of them held weapons with which their hands and reflexes and minds were perfectly attuned. So, despite the absolute madness and unreality of this moment, deep in the hearts of each of them, some ancient voice cried out a challenge. A warrior's call to arms, a bellow that would not have been out of place on the medieval battlefields of feudal Europe. As they yelled, their mouths began to curl into fierce smiles, as if remembering those ancient days of bloodshed and glory. With swords in hand, they rushed forward to meet the charge, hacking and smashing. The crowd of zombies swept over them in seconds. But oh, how glorious those seconds were! Chapter 99. Stebbins Little School, Stebbins, Pennsylvania. Des said, "What in the big green fuck was that all about?" "Goat has the drives, and I just told him that he needs to upload the contents and get them out." "I didn't hear that," said Des.
"I did,"
said Sammy Mora.
"And it was mighty damn clever. You think your friend understood what you were saying?"
"Positive."
"Good."
He took the phone from Trout and removed the cable he had jammed into it as soon as he realized who was on the other end of the call. The cable was plugged into a small computer strapped to Imora's forearm, and the captain spent a few seconds tapping keys. "What's that?" asked Des. "You running a trace?"
"Trying to. We already pinged the satellite Goat used earlier when he broadcast Billy's messages from here, and—"
His voice trailed off as he read the display. Then he snapped his fingers, and one of his people hurried over with a different sat phone connected to a portable battery pack. Sam snatched the phone and made a call, which was answered immediately.
"Sir, we may have caught a break. Goat Wyman is still alive, and we're reasonably sure he has the flash drives in his possession. The call was too short to get an exact fix on him. He's in Pennsylvania, closing in on the suburbs of Pittsburgh. We need a team monitoring the frequency of his sat phone, and we need people watching the net. Goat is going to upload videos of Homer Gibbon, interviews. They should be large files, which means fairly long upload times. Once the first is up, we need to capture his computer signature and backtrack him. He may try to upload the Volcker files at the same time, so we have to put together a pattern search that includes as many keywords as we think might be in the Volcker files.
I suggest the Latin names of the parasites. They're not likely to be in any other uploads tonight. Search on those and then feed that to the ground forces. We'll need all local and state police in on that too." Sam listened for a few seconds and then said, "No, sir, I don't think that's an option. The storm's getting worse. There's no way a chopper's going up in this, which means that my team is too far away. I'm handing the football back to you." He listened again. "That's not how I see it, Scott. I do have my priorities straight. I'm not in a position to be of use in the manhunt."